In the summer of 1789, something extraordinary happened. In the grand halls of Versailles, revolution was brewing. In the narrow streets of Paris, common people were awakening. This revolution would transform France. It would reshape human rights across the globe. It would change how we think about government and society itself. For the next several hours, you will experience the complete story. You will witness the fall of kings. You will see the rise of ordinary people. You will hear thunder of cannons echoing through palace courtyards. You will listen to whispered conspiracies in shadowed corners. You will walk through blood-soaked cobblestone streets. You will enter golden palace chambers where queens once danced. You will meet peasants and philosophers. You will encounter executioners and heroes. Their names still echo through history today. This is not merely a tale of political change. This is humanity's greatest attempt to remake the world. It was built on reason and justice. It was a story of dreams that soared to heaven. Those same dreams crashed to earth. Ordinary people discovered they possessed extraordinary power. This story continues to shape our lives today. Centuries have passed since the last guillotine blade fell silent. The world of 1788 was different from ours. Kings ruled by divine right. They claimed God himself had chosen them. They governed millions of people. These people were not called citizens. They were called subjects. They existed to serve their rulers. The idea seemed impossible then. Common people having rights. Common people choosing their own leaders. Common people shaping their own destiny. Yet in just a few short years this ancient order crumbled. It fell like a castle built of sand. The French Revolution proved something important. No throne is so high that people cannot topple it. No tradition is so sacred that reason cannot question it. No system is so strong that justice cannot break it apart. The ideas born in revolutionary France spread like wildfire. They crossed oceans and mountains. They inspired the liberation of South America. They planted seeds of democracy in human hearts. People who had never imagined such things became believers. The words liberty, equality, fraternity became a battle cry. That cry echoed from Boston to Budapest. It rang out from Haiti to Hungary. But this transformation came at a terrible cost. The French Revolution consumed its own children. It drowned noble ideals in rivers of blood. It showed the world a harsh truth. The road from tyranny to freedom is paved with good intentions. That same road is marked by countless graves. The same people proclaimed universal human rights. Those same people created machines of mass execution. The same revolution promised equality for all. That revolution produced Napoleon's dictatorship. Why did this happen? How did noble dreams become nightmarish reality? These questions haunted the revolutionaries themselves. They haunt historians today. They will haunt you as this incredible story unfolds. Picture now the France of 1788. The morning sun rises over Versailles. The magnificent palace awakens to another day. Golden gates gleam in the early light. Perfectly manicured gardens stretch toward the horizon. They look like a green carpet laid out for giants. Fountains dance in mathematical precision. Water sparkles in the morning air. Marble statues stand throughout the grounds. Gods and heroes frozen in eternal poses. Every hedge is trimmed to perfection. Every path leads exactly where architects intended. This is not merely a palace. This is a statement carved in stone and planted in earth. The palace declares that some people are born to rule. Others are born to obey. It proclaims that luxury and power belong to noble blood. It whispers a simple message. The distance between king and commoner is vast as the distance between heaven and earth. Inside these walls, courtiers move through elaborate ceremonies. They wear silk and velvet that shimmer in candlelight. Their powdered wigs rise like white clouds. Paint covers their faces in perfect masks. Their laughter sounds like crystal glasses touching in endless toasts. They speak in careful whispers. Court appointments and royal favour fill their conversations. They live in a world where details matter. The colour of a ribbon determines fate. The angle of a bow decides destiny. Meanwhile, beyond the Golden Gates, a different France awakens. In cramped city workshops, craftsmen begin another day. Their hands are skilled and weathered. They shape wood and metal with techniques passed down through generations. In countryside villages, farmers walk behind oxen. They work through fields their families have tended for centuries. Sun and wind have weathered their faces. Endless toil has bent their backs. These two worlds exist side by side, yet invisible walls separate them. Those walls seem stronger than stone. The peasant grows the wheat. That peasant will never taste fine bread from the royal table. The craftsman builds the carriage. That craftsman will never ride inside it. The soldier dies for France. That soldier will never meet the king he bleeds for. But invisible walls can crumble. They fall when enough people push against them at once. In 1788, millions of French people were beginning to push. Something new stirred in the coffee houses of Paris. It moved through village squares in remote provinces. People were reading books that asked dangerous questions. They gathered in groups that discussed forbidden ideas. They began to wonder why the world worked this way. They started to imagine that things could be different. The stage was set. The actors were taking their places. The greatest drama in human history was about to begin. To understand this revolution, you must first understand the world it destroyed. France in 1788 was divided into 3 estates. These divisions had existed for centuries. They seemed as permanent as the mountains and rivers. The first estate belonged to the clergy. Bishops lived in magnificent palaces. They dined on golden plates while village priests survived on scraps. Yet all clergy shared one precious gift. They paid no taxes to the king. God's servants, they claimed, owed nothing to earthly rulers. The church owned nearly 10% of all French land. This land produced enormous wealth. Not a single coin of tax came from these vast holdings. The second estate belonged to the nobility. These men and women traced their bloodlines back through centuries. Some claimed descent from Charlemagne himself. They owned most of the remaining land in France. Like the clergy, they paid no taxes. Noble blood, they insisted, was too pure to be contaminated by such common concerns. They hunted deer through forests while peasants starved. They built elaborate gardens while villages crumbled. The third estate contained everyone else. Wealthy merchants who owned ships and factories. Poor peasants who owned nothing but their calloused hands. City lawyers who wrote contracts for the rich. Village craftsmen who repaired wagon wheels. Street sweepers who cleaned noble waste from cobblestone paths. 98% of all French people belonged to this estate. Only the third estate paid taxes. They carried the entire weight of the kingdom on their shoulders. They funded the king's wars. They paid for the queen's jewellery. They supported the church's magnificent cathedrals. They maintained the roads that noble carriages travelled. Meet Jean-Baptiste, a peasant from Normandy. He wakes before dawn every day. His hands are cracked from working the soil. His back aches from years of labour. He grows wheat that feeds the nation. Yet Jean-Baptiste himself eats only black bread. His children wear clothes patched and repatched. His cottage has one room and a dirt floor. Every year Jean-Baptiste pays taxes to 3 different masters. He pays the taille to the king. He pays the tithe to the church. He pays feudal dues to his lord. These taxes consume half of everything he produces. Some years they consume more than half. Jean-Baptiste's grandfather paid the same taxes. His great-grandfather paid them too. The system seemed eternal. But Jean-Baptiste cannot hunt the deer that eat his crops. That privilege belongs to his noble lord alone. He cannot grind his grain at any mill he chooses. He must use his lord's mill and pay the lord's price. He cannot move to another village without permission. He cannot marry without approval. The law treats Jean-Baptiste like property that belongs to his betters. Now meet Marie-Claire, a silk weaver in Lyon. Her fingers move with incredible skill across delicate threads. She creates fabric that noble ladies wear to court. Marie-Claire herself owns one dress for Sunday and one for work. She lives in a tiny room above the workshop. 20 other families share the same building. Marie-Claire pays different taxes than Jean-Baptiste. She pays the gabelle on salt. Salt is controlled by the king's monopoly. She must buy expensive royal salt or break the law. She pays taxes on wine, on candles, on soap. She pays taxes when she moves goods from one city to another. Every aspect of her life feeds money to the royal treasury. The law treats Marie Claire differently than noble women. If a nobleman strikes her, she cannot strike back. If a nobleman cheats her in business, courts rarely side with common people. If she owes money to a noble, she goes to prison. If a noble owes money to her, she simply loses it. Yet Marie Claire reads. She has learned to write. She listens to conversations in coffee houses. New ideas flow through her mind like silk through her fingers. She begins to ask questions that her grandmother never dared whisper. Why should birth determine everything? Why should some people pay no taxes while others pay crushing amounts? Why should nobles hunt while peasants starve? Why should kings rule by divine right when they make such terrible mistakes? These questions spread like fire through dry grass. They jumped from the Third Estate into unexpected places. Some clergy began to question their privileges. Some nobles wondered about justice. But most importantly, millions of common people started believing that change was possible. At the centre of this crumbling system sat two people who never should have been king and queen. Louis XVI inherited the throne in 1774. He was 20 years old and completely unprepared to rule. His grandfather, Louis XV, had died suddenly. Young Louis had expected many more years to learn statecraft. Instead, he found himself responsible for 26 million subjects and massive problems he could not understand. Louis XVI was a kind man with simple tastes. He preferred working with his hands to governing a kingdom. He loved to hunt and make locks. He was most comfortable in his workshop, creating intricate mechanical devices. He possessed genuine concern for his people's welfare. But kindness and good intentions could not solve France's enormous problems. The new king lacked the ruthless intelligence that absolute monarchy required. He could not make difficult decisions quickly. He changed his mind constantly. He trusted advisers who told him what he wanted to hear. When faced with complex problems, he often did nothing at all. In a kingdom facing financial collapse, indecision was catastrophic. Beside him sat Marie Antoinette, daughter of Austria's powerful empress. She had married Louis when both were teenagers. The marriage was arranged to seal an alliance between France and Austria. French people never fully accepted their Austrian queen. They called her the Austrian with barely concealed contempt. Marie Antoinette was beautiful, charming, and completely frivolous. She loved gambling, dancing, and expensive clothes. She spent enormous sums on jewellery while common people struggled to buy bread. She built an elaborate fake village at Versailles where she played at being a shepherdess. Real shepherdesses found no humour in this performance. The queen surrounded herself with favourites who shared her love of luxury. She ignored traditional court ceremonies that previous queens had observed. French nobles felt insulted by her casual dismissal of their customs. She seemed to care nothing for French traditions or French people. Marie Antoinette never learned to speak French without a German accent. This reminded everyone of her foreign birth. When France went to war with Austria, people accused her of sending military secrets to her brother, the Austrian emperor. These accusations were probably false, but they spread through Paris like poisonous rumours. The royal couple's private life became public scandal. They had no children for the first 7 years of marriage. Crude pamphlets circulated through Paris, mocking their sexual failures. When children finally came, rumours claimed they belonged to other fathers. The monarchy's mystique depended on dignity and respect. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette commanded neither. Their political mistakes multiplied their personal failures. They chose advisers poorly. They dismissed competent ministers who told them hard truths. They kept incompetent ministers who flattered their prejudices. They borrowed money instead of raising taxes on the wealthy. They started expensive wars without considering how to pay for them. When financial crisis struck, they called the Assembly of Notables. This assembly contained the kingdom's most powerful nobles and clergy. The king asked them to accept new taxes. The notables refused. They had never paid taxes before. They saw no reason to start now. The king backed down instead of forcing the issue. This showed everyone that royal authority was weak. Marie Antoinette's spending became legendary. She ordered new gowns every week. She hired musicians for private concerts that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. She redecorated her apartments constantly. Each redecoration cost enough to feed a village for a year. The Queen's gambling debts reached astronomical proportions. She played cards every night until dawn. She bet amounts that could have built hospitals or schools. When she lost, as she frequently did, the royal treasury paid her debts. This money came from taxes paid by people who had never seen a playing card. French people began to hate their queen. They blamed her for the kingdom's financial problems. They accused her of caring nothing for French interests. They called her Madame Deficit behind her back. When bread became scarce, they said she had replied, "Let them eat cake." She probably never said these words. But people believed she had. That belief mattered more than truth. By 1788, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette had lost their people's respect. They had squandered the monarchy's prestige. They had proven themselves incapable of solving France's problems. They had created a vacuum of authority that revolution would soon fill. The French monarchy was drowning in debt. Wars had consumed the royal treasury for decades. The 7 Years' War against Britain had cost enormous sums. The American Revolution had cost even more. France had supported American colonists against Britain. This support helped create the United States. It also bankrupted the French kingdom. By 1788, France owed more money than it collected in taxes. The government spent half its annual income just paying interest on old debts. This left little money for essential services. Roads crumbled while debt payments continued. Schools closed while interest accumulated. The tax system made the crisis worse. The people who owned the most wealth paid no taxes at all. Nobles and clergy controlled most of France's land and money. Yet they contributed nothing to the royal treasury. The burden fell entirely on the Third Estate. These were the people least able to pay. Wealthy merchants paid some taxes, but they found ways to avoid the heaviest burdens. They moved money abroad. They invested in tax-exempt bonds. They hired lawyers who knew every loophole in the complex system. Middle-class citizens paid moderate taxes. Poor peasants and workers paid crushing amounts. The gabelle, or salt tax, illustrates the system's cruelty. Salt was essential for preserving food. Every family needed it to survive. The king controlled all salt production and sales. He set prices artificially high. Poor families spent enormous portions of their income on this necessity. Wealthy families barely noticed the cost. Nobles paid nothing at all. Tax collection was inefficient and corrupt. The king sold the right to collect taxes to private companies. These tax farmers paid the crown a fixed amount each year. They kept whatever extra they could squeeze from taxpayers. This system encouraged abuse and corruption. Tax farmers became rich while the royal treasury remained empty. Poor harvests made economic problems much worse. France depended on agriculture. Most people lived on farms or in agricultural villages. When crops failed, the entire economy suffered. The 1780s brought a series of terrible harvests. Grain became scarce and expensive. Bread was the foundation of the French diet. Poor people spent half their income on bread alone. When grain prices rose, they had no money left for other necessities. They could not buy clothes, tools, or medicine. They certainly could not pay increased taxes. Urban workers suffered especially during food shortages. They earned fixed wages in silver coins. When bread prices doubled, their purchasing power was cut in half. Hungry workers became angry workers. Angry workers became revolutionary workers. Rural peasants faced different but equally severe problems. They produced the grain but could not afford to eat it. Landlords and tax collectors took their crops as payment. Peasants ate inferior grains like rye and barley. In bad years they ate roots and grass. Some starved while their wheat fed wealthy city dwellers. The government tried various reforms to solve these problems. Finance ministers came and went with bewildering frequency. Each promised new solutions. Each failed to implement lasting changes. The fundamental problem remained unchanged. The people with money refused to pay taxes. The people without money could not pay more than they already did. Jacques Necker, a Swiss banker, served as finance minister twice. He published detailed accounts of royal finances. These accounts shocked the French people. They learned exactly how much the court spent on luxury while the kingdom went bankrupt. Necker's publications destroyed the monarchy's financial credibility. Other ministers proposed taxing noble land and church property. The nobles and clergy refused to consider such measures. They had ancient privileges that exempted them from taxation. They would not surrender these privileges voluntarily. The king lacked the power to force them to pay. By 1788, the monarchy faced a choice. It could declare bankruptcy and stop paying its debts. This would destroy confidence in royal authority. It could raise taxes dramatically on the Third Estate. This would cause massive social unrest. Or it could force the privileged estates to pay their share. This required political courage the king did not possess. The economic crisis was not just about money. It was about justice and fairness. Millions of French people worked hard and lived poorly. They paid heavy taxes to support a system that gave them nothing in return. Meanwhile, a tiny elite lived in luxury without contributing anything to the common good. This inequality created the revolutionary situation. Economic hardship alone does not cause revolutions, but economic hardship combined with obvious injustice creates explosive conditions. France in 1788 was a powder keg waiting for a spark. While France's economy crumbled, new ideas spread through coffee houses and salons. These ideas challenged everything the old system represented. They came from philosophers who dared to ask forbidden questions. What if kings were not chosen by God? What if common people had natural rights? What if society could be organized according to reason instead of tradition? Voltaire was the most famous of these philosophers. His real name was François-Marie Arouet. He had spent years in exile for criticizing the monarchy and church. From his exile, he wrote books and letters that smuggled dangerous ideas into France. Voltaire attacked religious superstition with brilliant wit. He mocked noble pretensions with devastating sarcasm. Common sense is not so common, Voltaire wrote. He urged people to think for themselves instead of accepting authority blindly. He promoted religious tolerance in a kingdom where Protestants faced persecution. He advocated free speech in a country where censorship was absolute. His books were banned and burned. People read them anyway, passing illegal copies from hand to hand. Jean-Jacques Rousseau asked even more radical questions. He began his most famous work with explosive words, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." These chains, Rousseau argued, were created by human society, not by God or nature. Therefore, human society could be changed. Rousseau's social contract described government as an agreement between rulers and ruled. People gave up some freedoms in exchange for protection and order. But if rulers broke their part of the bargain, people had the right to choose new leaders. This idea directly contradicted the divine right of kings. The philosopher also wrote about education and natural goodness. Children, he claimed, were born innocent and corrupted by society. Proper education could create better citizens and a better world. These ideas appealed to parents who wanted their children to have opportunities they had never enjoyed. Baron de Montesquieu studied different forms of government. His book, The Spirit of Laws, compared monarchies, republics, and despotisms. He concluded that the best governments divided power among different branches. No single person or group should control everything. This separation of powers would prevent tyranny and protect liberty. Montesquieu's ideas influenced the American Constitution. They also shaped French revolutionary thinking. If Americans could create a republic with separated powers, why not the French? If colonists could overthrow British rule, why not overthrow royal rule? These philosophical ideas spread through new social institutions. Parisian salons brought together nobles, merchants, lawyers, and writers. Intelligent women like Madame Geoffrin hosted regular gatherings, where ideas flowed as freely as wine. Social barriers relaxed in these informal settings. A baker's son might debate a duke as equals. Coffee houses served similar functions for less wealthy citizens. Men gathered to drink coffee, read newspapers, and discuss politics. These establishments became laboratories of democracy. People learned to express their opinions publicly. They practiced the art of political debate. The printing press made these discussions possible. Books became cheaper and more widely available. Literacy rates increased, especially in cities. People who had never owned a book began building personal libraries. Knowledge was no longer the exclusive property of the elite. Newspapers and pamphlets spread ideas even faster than books. Short, cheap publications could be produced quickly and distributed widely. They commented on current events and proposed solutions to immediate problems. They made philosophy practical and urgent. The Encyclopedia, compiled by Denis Diderot, represented the pinnacle of Enlightenment thinking. This massive work attempted to collect all human knowledge in a single publication. It included articles on everything from agriculture to philosophy. More importantly, it promoted reason, science, and progress over tradition, superstition, and prejudice. Church and government authorities tried to suppress the encyclopedia. They recognized its revolutionary potential. The work questioned religious authority subtly but persistently. It promoted scientific thinking over biblical literalism. It suggested that human reason could solve problems better than prayer or divine intervention. These ideas reached different social groups in different ways. Educated nobles and wealthy merchants read philosophical works directly. They attended salons where authors presented their latest thoughts. Some became convinced that the old system needed reform. Middle-class professionals like lawyers and doctors embraced Enlightenment ideas enthusiastically. These concepts justified their own social ambitions. If merit mattered more than birth, they could rise higher in society. If reason guided government, their education would be valued. Common people encountered these ideas in simplified forms. Pamphlets translated complex philosophy into everyday language. Street speakers repeated key concepts in public squares. Popular songs carried revolutionary messages to people who could not read. The ideas took root because they explained people's daily experiences. Why did nobles live in luxury while peasants starved? Because society was organized irrationally. Why did incompetent kings make terrible decisions? Because divine right was superstition. Why did the church support oppression? Because priests served earthly power instead of heavenly justice. By 1788, these revolutionary ideas had created a revolutionary consciousness. Millions of French people no longer accepted the old order as natural or inevitable. They began to imagine alternatives. They started to believe that change was not only possible but necessary. The intellectual revolution preceded the political revolution. Ideas prepared the ground where actions would take root. When economic crisis created the opportunity for change, people were ready with new concepts of government and society. The Enlightenment had armed them with the most dangerous weapons of all, questions and dreams. In 1787, France stood on the edge of financial collapse. The royal treasury was empty. Interest payments consumed half the government's income. King Louis XVI faced a terrible choice. He could declare bankruptcy and destroy royal credibility forever. Or he could force the privileged classes to pay taxes for the first time in centuries. The king chose a middle path that satisfied no one. He summoned the assembly of notables. These were the kingdom's most powerful nobles and clergy. He asked them politely to accept new taxes. This was like asking wolves to protect sheep. Charles Alexandre de Calonne served as finance minister. He was a brilliant man who understood France's problems clearly. Calonne knew that the tax system was fundamentally unjust. The people who owned the most wealth paid nothing. The people who owned the least paid everything. Abuses in tax payment are defended by self-interest, influence, wealth, and ancient prejudices which seem to be hallowed by time, Calonne told the assembly. But what were these privileges compared to the common good and the necessity of the state? The notables listened politely to Calonne's speeches. Then they rejected his reforms completely. They would not give up their tax exemptions. They had never paid taxes before. They saw no reason to start now. The financial crisis was not their problem. Let the Third Estate solve it. This rejection proved that the old system could not reform itself. The privileged classes would never voluntarily surrender their advantages. Change would have to come from outside their gilded circles. It would have to come from below. King Louis XVI dismissed Calonne in disgrace. The finance minister had told hard truths that no one wanted to hear. The king replaced him with ministers who promised easier solutions. But easy solutions did not exist for France's enormous problems. The financial crisis deepened through 1788. The government could not borrow more money. Creditors had lost confidence in royal promises. Tax collection became nearly impossible. Angry taxpayers refused to pay new assessments. Some regions stopped sending money to Paris entirely. Finally, the king made a desperate decision. He would convene the Estates General for the first time since 1614. This ancient assembly represented all three estates of French society. Perhaps the estates could solve problems that individual ministers could not address. The decision to summon the Estates General created tremendous excitement across France. People interpreted it as a sign that change was finally possible. The king was asking for their advice. This suggested that their opinions mattered. For the first time in generations, common people felt they had a voice in government. Elections took place throughout the spring of 1789. The process was complicated and indirect. But millions of French people participated in choosing representatives. Peasants in remote villages discussed political issues for the first time in their lives. Urban workers debated the future of their kingdom. Each electoral district prepared cahiers de doléances, or lists of grievances. These documents revealed the depth of popular anger. Village after village complained about crushing taxes and noble privileges. They demanded equal justice under law. They asked for freedom from arbitrary arrest and censorship. The cahiers from the Third Estate read like revolutionary manifestos. All citizens should pay taxes in proportion to their wealth, wrote one district. No one should be exempt because of birth or privilege. Another declared that the law should be the same for everyone, noble and commoner alike. Even some noble cahiers expressed sympathy for reform. Younger nobles had read Enlightenment philosophy. They questioned the justice of the old system. They worried that stubborn resistance would lead to violent revolution. Better to accept moderate changes than risk losing everything. The clergy split between high and low churchmen. Bishops defended their privileges and vast wealth. Village priests sided with their poor parishioners. These humble clerics understood suffering because they witnessed it every day. They wanted the church to serve justice instead of power. As representatives gathered in Versailles, expectations rose to dangerous heights. People believed the Estates General would solve all of France's problems quickly and peacefully. They imagined that nobles would accept equality voluntarily. They assumed the king would embrace constitutional limits on royal power. These expectations were impossibly high. The Estates General had not met for 175 years. No one really knew how it should function. Ancient procedures made no sense in the modern world. Representatives arrived with conflicting ideas about their mission and authority. The Third Estate delegates were mostly educated professionals. Lawyers, doctors, and merchants dominated their ranks. Few actual peasants or workers had been elected. These middle-class representatives understood Enlightenment ideas. They dreamed of creating a rational, just society based on merit instead of birth. They also understood that they represented the vast majority of French people. The Third Estate contained 98% of the population. Yet under traditional rules, each estate received only one vote. The First and Second Estates could always outvote the Third Estate 2-1. This seemed obviously unfair to representatives who spoke for 24 million people. The stage was set for confrontation. The Third Estate would demand voting by head instead of voting by estate. The privileged estates would refuse, someone would have to back down, or the meeting would collapse in failure, leaving France's problems unsolved and revolutionary anger even higher. The Estates General convened at Versailles on May 5, 1789. The ceremony was magnificent and meaningless. Representatives wore elaborate costumes that emphasized their different social ranks. The Third Estate dressed in simple black. Nobles wore silk and feathers. Clergy displayed religious robes heavy with golden threads. King Louis XVI gave a forgettable speech about France's financial problems. He offered no leadership or clear direction. He simply asked the estates to find solutions while preserving traditional privileges. This was like asking them to square the circle or turn lead into gold. Arguments began immediately over voting procedures. The Third Estate demanded that all representatives meet together in one hall. They wanted each delegate to cast one vote. This would give them a natural majority since they represented most of the population. The First and Second Estates insisted on traditional procedures. Each estate would meet separately. Each would cast one collective vote. This preserved their ability to outvote the Third Estate whenever their interests aligned. For 6 weeks the deadlock continued. No real business could be conducted while this fundamental question remained unresolved. The Third Estate refused to verify their credentials or begin work until the voting issue was settled. The privileged estates refused to change ancient customs. During these weeks of frustration, Third Estate delegates talked among themselves constantly. They met in cafes and boarding houses throughout Versailles. They shared ideas and hardened their resolve. They began to see themselves not as representatives of one estate, but as representatives of the entire French nation. Abbé Emmanuel Sieyès expressed their thoughts in a famous pamphlet. "What is the Third Estate?" he asked. "Everything. What has it been until now in the political order? Nothing. What does it want to become? Something." On June 17, 1789, the Third Estate took a revolutionary step. They declared themselves the National Assembly. They claimed to represent the French nation, not just one social class. They invited delegates from the other estates to join them, but they would proceed with or without noble and clerical participation. This declaration changed everything. The Third Estate had rejected the entire structure of the old regime. They no longer accepted the division of society into separate estates. They proclaimed that all French people belonged to a single nation with common interests. King Louis XVI panicked when he learned of this development. His advisers convinced him to lock the Third Estate out of their usual meeting hall. Royal guards barred the doors and posted signs announcing repairs. The message was clear. The king would not tolerate this revolutionary behaviour. But the Third Estate delegates would not be deterred so easily. On June 20th, they found the doors to their hall locked and guarded. Rain was falling on the grounds of Versailles. They needed shelter and a place to meet. Someone suggested the royal tennis court nearby. The tennis court was a large rectangular building with high windows and wooden floors. It was designed for playing jeu de paume, an ancient sport similar to modern tennis. The space was not comfortable for formal meetings, but it would serve their purposes. Nearly 600 delegates crowded into the tennis court. Their voices echoed off the bare walls as they debated what to do next. Some suggested returning to their districts and abandoning the Estates General entirely. Others wanted to stand firm and continue meeting despite royal opposition. Jean-Sylvain Bailly, an astronomer from Paris, served as president of the Third Estate. He was a moderate man who preferred compromise to confrontation, but the king's actions had convinced him that compromise was impossible. The monarchy would never accept meaningful reform voluntarily. Bailly proposed that they take a solemn oath together. They would swear not to separate until France had a new constitution. This constitution would limit royal power and protect citizen rights. They would remain united no matter what obstacles the king placed in their path. The oath was written quickly on a simple piece of paper. Its language was clear and powerful. The National Assembly, considering that it has been called to establish the constitution of the kingdom, decrees that all members of this assembly shall immediately take a solemn oath not to separate until the constitution of the kingdom is established. One by one, nearly every delegate stepped forward to sign. Their signatures covered the paper in dark ink that seemed to pulse with revolutionary energy. Only one delegate refused to sign. Martin Dauch from Castelnaudary believed they were exceeding their authority. He sat alone and silent while his colleagues made history. The tennis court oath transformed French politics forever. For the first time, representatives of the people had claimed sovereignty for themselves. They had rejected divine right monarchy and proclaimed popular government. They had declared that constitutions came from nations, not from kings. News of the oath spread rapidly throughout France. People gathered in public squares to hear the latest reports from Versailles. Many cheered the courage of their representatives. Others worried that such boldness would bring terrible royal punishment. The king found himself in an impossible position. He could accept the National Assembly and abandon absolute monarchy forever. Or he could use force to crush this rebellion and risk provoking widespread revolt. Either choice would fundamentally change the nature of his kingdom. The revolution had begun not with violence, but with words and signatures on paper. The Third Estate had declared their independence from the old regime. Now they had to make that independence a reality. The real test would come when the king decided how to respond to their challenge. While delegates debated in Versailles, a different kind of revolution was spreading through the French countryside. Rural peasants had heard about the Estates General and the National Assembly. They understood that change was coming, but they would not wait patiently for gentlemen in silk stockings to improve their lives. The summer of 1789 brought terrible anxiety to rural France. Harvest time was approaching, but the crops looked poor again. Bread remained expensive and scarce. Rumours flew from village to village like wildfire in dry grass. Foreign armies were marching toward France. Nobles were hiring brigands to attack peasant communities. The king would punish rural areas for supporting the Third Estate. Most of these rumours were false, but frightened people believed them anyway. Fear is contagious, especially among people who have good reason to be afraid. French peasants had suffered under the feudal system for centuries. They expected their oppressors to strike back when challenged. The Great Fear began in late July 1789. No one knows exactly where it started. Perhaps in Normandy, where peasants reported seeing suspicious armed bands. Perhaps in Champagne, where smoke on the horizon suggested approaching armies. Perhaps in a dozen places at once, as anxiety reached the breaking point simultaneously. Village church bells began ringing urgent warnings. Peasants grabbed whatever weapons they could find. Hunting rifles, pitchforks, kitchen knives, and farming tools became instruments of revolution. Men who had never fought anything more dangerous than weeds in their fields prepared for battle. But when peasants gathered to defend their communities, they discovered something surprising. The enemies they feared did not exist. There were no foreign armies, no noble brigands, no royal punishment expeditions. The immediate threat was imaginary. However, the feudal system that oppressed them was perfectly real. Their lord's chateau sat on the hill overlooking their village. Inside that chateau were the documents that bound them to centuries of servitude. Feudal contracts, tax rolls, and rent agreements kept them in perpetual poverty. If those documents disappeared, they would be free. The logic was simple and irresistible. Peasants had armed themselves to fight imaginary enemies. Why not fight real oppression instead? They had gathered in large groups with weapons in their hands. The chateaux were lightly defended. Most nobles had gone to Versailles or Paris, leaving their estates in the care of a few servants. The attacks began almost spontaneously. Peasants marched up the hills to their lord's chateau. They demanded that feudal documents be surrendered and destroyed. Some nobles cooperated, hoping to avoid violence. They handed over the papers and watched centuries of family privilege burn in great bonfires. Other nobles resisted or simply were not present to negotiate. Peasants broke down doors and searched through archives themselves. They seized every document they could find. Tax rolls, rent agreements, court records, and genealogical charts all fed the revolutionary flames. The burning of feudal documents had enormous symbolic importance. Peasants were literally destroying the written foundation of their oppression. They were erasing the legal basis of noble privilege. They were declaring that ancient contracts could not bind free people forever. Violence accompanied many of these attacks. Centuries of resentment exploded in a few terrifying hours. Some nobles who tried to defend their property were killed. Chateaux were looted and sometimes burned to the ground. Beautiful tapestries and furniture were destroyed along with hated legal documents. The violence was shocking but limited. Peasants targeted the symbols and instruments of feudal oppression more than individual nobles. They wanted freedom, not revenge. When they found the documents they sought, they usually left peacefully. The revolution in the countryside was remarkably focused and disciplined. News of peasant revolts reached Versailles just as the National Assembly was debating the future of France. Urban delegates suddenly realized that they were not the only revolutionaries in the kingdom. Millions of rural people were taking action on their own initiative. They were not waiting for permission from lawyers and merchants to change their lives. This peasant uprising created both opportunity and danger for the National Assembly. It demonstrated that the entire Third Estate supported fundamental change, but it also showed that change could become violent and uncontrollable. If the Assembly did not act quickly to channel popular energy, revolution might spiral into chaos. The connection between urban and rural revolution was crucial. City delegates provided intellectual leadership and political strategy. Rural peasants provided numerical strength and revolutionary determination. Together, they created an irresistible force for change. The Great Fear revealed the power of popular mobilization. Ordinary people acting together could accomplish what individual leaders never could. They could challenge authority directly and win. They could destroy ancient institutions in a matter of hours. They could remake the world according to their own vision of justice. But the Great Fear also revealed the dangers of uncontrolled revolution. Fear and rumors could trigger massive violence. Popular anger, once unleashed, could target innocent people along with guilty oppressors. Revolution could consume the innocent along with the corrupt. The National Assembly faced a critical choice. They could condemn peasant violence and ally themselves with property owners. This might restore order, but would abandon the revolution's most committed supporters. Or they could embrace peasant demands and channel rural energy toward constructive change. The decision they made would determine whether the French Revolution remained a political movement or became a social transformation. It would decide whether change came through legal reforms or popular upheaval. It would shape the kind of society that would emerge from the ashes of the old regime. July 14th, 1789, dawned hot and humid in Paris. The air hung heavy with moisture and tension. For days, rumours had swept through the city like fire through paper. The king was gathering troops around Paris. Foreign regiments were marching toward the capital. Royal armies would crush the National Assembly and restore absolute monarchy by force. These rumours were not entirely false. King Louis XVI had indeed called additional troops to the Paris region. But he claimed they were needed to maintain order, not to attack the Assembly. However, Parisians did not believe royal explanations. They had learned to distrust everything that came from Versailles. The economic situation in Paris made political tensions worse. Bread remained scarce and expensive. Unemployment was high as luxury industries collapsed. Wealthy customers had fled the city or stopped spending money. Ordinary workers faced hunger and hopelessness simultaneously. On July 11th, the king dismissed Jacques Necker, his popular finance minister. Necker was a Swiss Protestant who had published detailed accounts of royal spending. Parisians considered him honest and competent. His dismissal seemed to prove that the king opposed all reform. If Necker could be fired, who was safe? News of Necker's dismissal reached Paris on July 12th. Crowds gathered in the gardens of the Palais Royal to hear the latest reports. Camille Desmoulins, a young lawyer and journalist, jumped onto a table to address the crowd. He waved a green leaf as a symbol of hope. "Citizens," he shouted, "there is not a moment to lose. I have just come from Versailles. Necker has been dismissed. This dismissal is the signal for a St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of patriots. The crowd responded with fury and determination. They poured out of the gardens and into the streets of Paris. They smashed windows of businesses that supported the royal government. They seized weapons from gun shops and arsenals. They built barricades across major intersections. Within hours, Paris had become a city in revolt. The crowds needed gunpowder more than anything else. They had seized thousands of muskets and rifles, but without gunpowder, these weapons were useless clubs. Someone remembered that the Invalids, a military hospital for wounded soldiers, contained large stores of gunpowder and cannon. On the morning of July 14th, thousands of Parisians marched to the Invalides. The small garrison there could not resist such overwhelming numbers. They surrendered without a fight and allowed the crowd to take whatever they needed. The revolutionaries seized 28,000 muskets and 20 cannon, but they found very little gunpowder. Someone in the crowd shouted that the Bastille contained huge stores of gunpowder. The Bastille was a medieval fortress on the eastern edge of Paris. It served as a prison for enemies of the state and a symbol of royal oppression. High walls and thick towers made it seem impregnable, but desperate people would attack heaven itself if necessary. The crowd marched across Paris toward the Bastille. Men, women, and children joined the procession as it moved through the streets. They carried every imaginable weapon: swords, pistols, pikes, hammers, and kitchen knives. They sang revolutionary songs and shouted demands for liberty. The Bastille was commanded by Bernard René de Launay, a professional soldier who had served the king faithfully for decades. He had only 82 men to defend the massive fortress. 32 were Swiss guards, experienced soldiers who could be trusted in battle. The rest were invalids, disabled veterans who served as guards and caretakers. Delaunay watched nervously as the crowd gathered outside his walls. He counted nearly 1,000 people, and more were arriving every minute. He had enough supplies to withstand a long siege, but his small garrison could not hold the walls if the crowd attacked in earnest. The fortress contained only 7 prisoners that day. 4 were forgers serving sentences for counterfeiting. 2 were mentally ill noblemen whose families had paid to have them confined. 1 was the Count of Solange, imprisoned for sexual misconduct. None were political prisoners suffering for opposing tyranny. But the number of prisoners did not matter to the crowd outside. The Bastille represented arbitrary royal power and aristocratic privilege. It was where the king imprisoned people without trial. It was where victims of lettres de cachet disappeared forever. It embodied everything they hated about the old regime. Negotiations began around noon. A delegation from the crowd entered the fortress to speak with Delaunay. They demanded that he surrender the gunpowder and withdraw his garrison. They promised that no harm would come to his men if he cooperated peacefully. Delaunay was trapped in an impossible situation. His orders were to defend the fortress, but he had no hope of success against such overwhelming numbers. He could retreat into the central keep and hold out for a few days. But then what? No relief force was coming to save him. The crowd grew increasingly impatient as negotiations dragged on. Some began to shout demands for immediate surrender. Others called for storming the walls without further delay. The summer heat made tempers even shorter and more explosive. Around 1:30 in the afternoon, someone in the crowd opened fire on the fortress walls. Whether this was planned or accidental, no one knows, but it triggered a general assault on the Bastille. Hundreds of people surged forward with ladders and ropes. They began climbing the outer walls despite musket fire from the defenders. The attackers included ordinary workers and shopkeepers, but also experienced soldiers. Many had fought in the American Revolution or other recent wars. They knew how to attack fortified positions. They organized themselves into disciplined units and coordinated their assault. 2 men named Pierre-Auguste Hulin and Stanislas Maillard emerged as leaders during the attack. They directed groups of fighters to different parts of the fortress. They organized covering fire to protect men climbing the walls. They turned a chaotic mob into something resembling an army. The decisive moment came when attackers gained control of the drawbridge mechanism. They lowered the bridge over the inner moat and poured into the central courtyard. Delaunay realized that further resistance was hopeless. He ordered his men to cease fire and surrendered the fortress. The crowd's victory was complete but costly. Nearly 100 attackers had been killed or wounded in the assault. Their sacrifice made the Bastille a sacred symbol of popular struggle against oppression. July 14th would become the French national holiday, commemorating this moment when ordinary people proved they could defeat royal power. Delaunay and his garrison were promised safe conduct out of Paris, but the crowd's anger was too great for such mercy. Someone accused the commander of ordering his men to fire on the people. Others claimed he had tried to blow up the fortress with everyone inside. These accusations were probably false, but enraged people believed them. Delaunay was seized and beaten by the crowd. Despite attempts by leaders like Herlin to protect him, he was killed and his head was cut off. It was mounted on a pike and paraded through the streets of Paris. This gruesome display showed that revolution could be both noble and savage. The storming of the Bastille became the founding myth of the French Revolution. It proved that united people could overcome any obstacle. It demonstrated that liberty was worth dying for. It showed that the old regime could be destroyed by popular will. But it also revealed the violence that lay beneath revolutionary idealism. The same people who proclaimed universal human rights could murder prisoners in cold blood. The same movement that promised justice could become a vengeful mob. The revolution's greatest triumph carried the seeds of its future terrors. Word of the Bastille's fall spread throughout France within days. Church bells rang in celebration. People gathered in town squares to toast the victory. The impossible had happened. The people of Paris had defeated the symbol of royal oppression. If the Bastille could fall, what couldn't be accomplished? The revolution had found its symbol and its martyrs. July 14th, 1789 would be remembered as the day when France chose freedom over submission. But it would also be remembered as the day when revolutionary violence first stained the streets of Paris with blood. Both memories would shape everything that followed. The fall of the Bastille changed everything. Within days, the king recalled Jacques Necker to his position as finance minister. Royal troops withdrew from around Paris. The National Assembly suddenly found itself with real power instead of just bold words on paper. But power brought responsibility. The Assembly had promised to write a constitution for France. They had sworn the tennis court oath to create a new form of government. Now they had to deliver on those promises. The question was, what kind of government should France have? The delegates began with principles rather than practical details. They wanted to establish the philosophical foundation for their new constitution. What rights did human beings possess simply by being born? What was the proper relationship between government and citizens? These were not just French questions. They were universal human questions. Lafayette, the hero of the American Revolution, proposed that France adopt its own Declaration of Rights. He had fought alongside George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. He understood how the American Declaration of Independence had inspired a new nation. France needed similar inspiration. The Assembly appointed a committee to draft the declaration. The work proved more difficult than anyone expected. Every word mattered enormously. These principles would guide France for generations to come. They would influence other nations around the world. The committee members felt the weight of history on their shoulders. Heated debates filled the Assembly Hall during the summer of 1789. Should the Declaration list citizen duties as well as citizen rights? Some delegates thought people needed to understand their obligations to society. Others argued that duties were obvious while rights had been ignored for too long. Should the Declaration mention God and religion? Many delegates were devout Catholics who believed rights came from divine sources. Others followed Enlightenment thinking that located rights in human nature itself. They wanted to separate politics from religious authority completely. The most difficult question concerned the scope of these rights. Were they universal principles that applied to all human beings everywhere? Or were they specific to French circumstances and French people? The language they chose would determine how their declaration influenced the rest of the world. After weeks of argument, the Assembly adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen on August 26, 1789. The title itself reflected their compromise. Rights belonged to man in the universal sense, but they were exercised by citizens of particular nations. The Declaration began with ringing words that echoed around the world. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. This single sentence destroyed centuries of aristocratic privilege. Birth could no longer determine a person's place in society. All human beings possessed equal dignity and equal claims to liberty. The Declaration defined liberty as the power to do anything that does not harm others. This was revolutionary thinking. Under the old regime, people could only do what authority permitted. Now the assumption was reversed. People could do anything except what was specifically forbidden by just laws. Equality meant that all citizens are equal before the law. Noble birth provided no special privileges in courts or government offices. The same rules applied to everyone regardless of their social background. Merit and virtue would replace bloodline and connections. The Declaration proclaimed freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and freedom from arbitrary arrest. These rights had been denied to French people for centuries. Now they were declared sacred and inviolable. Government existed to protect these rights, not to grant them as favours. Property rights received special protection in the Declaration. Property being a sacred and inviolable right, no one may be deprived of it except for an obvious requirement of public necessity. This language reflected the delegates' middle-class backgrounds. They wanted to protect their own wealth while limiting royal power. The Declaration established the principle that law is the expression of the general will. Legitimate government required popular consent. Kings could not rule by divine right if the people themselves were the source of political authority. This principle would reshape governments across Europe and beyond. But who exactly were the people? The Declaration used masculine language throughout. It spoke of the rights of man and referred to citizens with male pronouns. Women were not explicitly excluded, but they were not explicitly included either. This ambiguity would create problems in the years to come. The Declaration also remained silent about slavery. France controlled profitable sugar colonies in the Caribbean worked by enslaved Africans. Colonial delegates insisted that any discussion of slavery would destroy the French economy. The Assembly chose to ignore this massive violation of human rights. Despite these limitations, the Declaration of Rights became one of history's most influential documents. It provided the language that oppressed people everywhere would use to demand freedom. It established principles that would guide democratic movements for centuries. News of the Declaration spread rapidly beyond France's borders. Translations appeared in dozens of languages. Political reformers from Poland to Peru quoted its language in their own struggles against tyranny. The French Revolution was becoming a global phenomenon. The Declaration also created expectations that the French government would struggle to meet. If all men were truly equal, why did some have vastly more wealth than others? If liberty was sacred, why did economic necessity force some people to work for starvation wages? Revolutionary principles raised questions that went far beyond what most delegates intended. Conservative critics attacked the Declaration as dangerous nonsense. They argued that abstract rights had no meaning without stable institutions to protect them. They predicted that revolutionary idealism would lead to chaos and violence. Events would prove that their fears contained uncomfortable truths, but for millions of oppressed people around the world, the Declaration of Rights offered hope for a better future. It proclaimed that freedom was not a privilege to be granted by rulers. It was a birthright that belonged to every human being. This message would inspire democratic revolutions for generations to come. The National Assembly faced a crisis in early August 1789. Reports flooded in from across France describing peasant attacks on noble estates. The Great Fear had triggered widespread rural violence. Chateaux were burning, feudal documents were being destroyed, Traditional authority was collapsing in the countryside. Some delegates wanted to use military force to restore order. They argued that property rights had to be protected even during revolutionary times. Peasants could not be allowed to destroy centuries of legal agreements simply because they found those agreements unjust. Other delegates understood that peasant violence reflected genuine grievances that had been ignored for too long. The feudal system was fundamentally unfair. Peasants worked the land but received few benefits from their labour. Lords collected taxes and fees that pushed rural families into desperate poverty. The assembly had to choose between supporting property owners or embracing popular demands for change. This choice would determine whether the revolution remained a middle-class political movement or became a broader social transformation that affected every aspect of French life. On the evening of August 4th, 1789, an extraordinary session began in the Assembly Hall. The Vicomte de Noailles, a liberal nobleman, rose to address his colleagues. He proposed that the Assembly voluntarily abolish all feudal privileges and obligations. This was a stunning suggestion from someone who benefited enormously from the old system. The people seek to shake off a yoke that has weighed upon them for centuries, Noailles declared. It would be both just and wise to satisfy their legitimate demands. He called upon his fellow nobles to sacrifice their privileges for the good of the nation. What happened next seemed like magic or madness, depending on one's perspective. Noble after noble stood up to renounce ancient privileges. They competed with each other to make the most generous sacrifices. The session continued past midnight as delegates surrendered rights their families had held for generations. The Duke of Aiguillon abandoned his feudal courts and hunting privileges. The Marquis de Foucault gave up his exclusive right to maintain dovecotes and rabbit warrens. Bishop after bishop renounced church tithes and special tax exemptions. Provincial representatives surrendered local privileges that had made their regions unique. This extraordinary night became known as the August Decrees. By dawn on August 5th, the Assembly had abolished the entire feudal system in France. Serfdom was ended. Feudal dues were eliminated. Exclusive hunting rights disappeared. Church tithes were cancelled. Provincial privileges were swept away. The motivation for this remarkable display of generosity was complex. Some nobles genuinely believed that feudalism was unjust and outdated. They had been influenced by Enlightenment ideas about equality and natural rights. They wanted to create a more rational and fair society. Hey, welcome to Natural Reader's AI voice generator, our only application built to assist creators and companies alike with commercial license voiceover audio. Other nobles acted from more practical considerations. They realized that peasant violence would continue until feudal grievances were addressed. Better to surrender privileges voluntarily than to lose them through revolutionary force. Controlled change was preferable to chaotic destruction. The Assembly also calculated that abolishing feudalism would strengthen national unity. France faced threats from foreign powers who opposed the revolution. Internal divisions weakened the country's ability to defend itself. Eliminating feudal conflicts would allow all French people to unite against external enemies, but the August Decrees created as many problems as they solved. Many feudal obligations involved complex property relationships that could not be simply abolished overnight. Peasants had worked noble land for generations in exchange for various services and payments. What happened to these arrangements now? The Assembly decreed that some feudal obligations reflected legitimate property rights that required compensation. Peasants would have to pay their former lords for the privilege of becoming free landowners. This seemed reasonable to middle-class delegates who understood property law, but peasants saw this requirement very differently. They had worked the land for centuries. Their families had improved the soil and built the farms. Why should they pay for land that their labour had made valuable? Why should former oppressors receive compensation for giving up unjust privileges? The compensation requirement created lasting rural unrest. Many peasants simply refused to make the required payments. They considered themselves free regardless of what the Assembly decreed. This led to years of conflict between former lords and former serfs over property rights. The August Decrees also eliminated tax exemptions that had made the First and Second Estates special. All French citizens would now pay taxes based on their ability to contribute. This seemed obviously fair to Third Estate delegates who had borne the entire tax burden for centuries. But tax equality had enormous practical implications. The state desperately needed revenue to pay its debts and fund essential services. Noble and church lands represented vast untapped sources of potential tax income. Bringing this wealth into the tax system could solve France's financial crisis. However, actually collecting taxes from previously exempt groups proved extremely difficult. Many nobles and clergy found ways to avoid or minimize their new obligations. They moved assets abroad or transferred property to family members. The assembly lacked the administrative machinery to enforce tax collection effectively. The elimination of church tithes created particular problems. Tithes had supported not just wealthy bishops but also village priests and church charities. These institutions provided essential services that no other organization was prepared to take over. Poor relief, education, and healthcare all depended on church funding. The assembly promised that the state would assume responsibility for supporting essential church functions. But the treasury had no money for these new obligations. Many parishes found themselves without adequate income to maintain their activities. Village priests who had supported the revolution began to suffer real hardship. Despite these problems, the August Decrees represented a fundamental transformation of French society. Legal equality replaced hereditary privilege. Citizens replaced subjects. A unified nation replaced a collection of competing estates and regions. Despite these problems, the August Decrees represented a fundamental transformation of French society. Legal equality replaced hereditary privilege. Citizens replaced subjects. A unified nation replaced a collection of competing estates and regions. The decrees also demonstrated the power of revolutionary enthusiasm to overcome centuries of tradition. In a single night, delegates had accomplished changes that might have taken generations under normal circumstances. They proved that human institutions could be reshaped by human will. But the August Decrees also revealed the gap between revolutionary ideals and practical realities. Abolishing feudalism on paper was easier than eliminating its effects in daily life. Legal equality was simpler to decree than economic justice was to achieve. The revolution was learning a lesson that would become increasingly painful. Destroying the old system was much easier than building a better replacement. Good intentions could not overcome complex social and economic realities. The revolution would need more than noble gestures to create the just society it promised. The National Assembly spent 2 years writing a new constitution for France. This document would establish the structure of government and define the relationship between rulers and citizens. It would transform France from an absolute monarchy into a limited constitutional system based on the separation of powers. The Constitution of 1791 reflected the delegates' belief in moderate rational reform. Most Assembly members did not want to abolish the monarchy entirely. They admired the British system where kings reigned but elected parliaments governed. They sought to limit royal power while preserving the stability that monarchy traditionally provided. The Constitution established a legislative assembly as the primary governing body. King Louis XVI would remain as head of state, but with severely limited powers. He could not make laws or levy taxes on his own authority. He could appoint ministers, but the assembly could refuse to fund their activities. The king became a constitutional figurehead rather than an absolute ruler. The Constitution did give the king one important power: the suspensive veto. He could delay the implementation of laws passed by the assembly for up to 6 years. This provision sparked heated debate among the delegates. Some wanted to give the king no veto power at all. Others insisted that executive authority required the ability to check legislative excess. The compromise satisfied neither side completely. The king's supporters thought 6 years was too short to be meaningful. Republicans argued that any veto power violated the principle of popular sovereignty. The veto would become a constant source of conflict between the king and the assembly. The Constitution also established an independent judiciary to interpret laws and protect citizen rights. Judges would be elected rather than appointed by royal authority. This represented a dramatic change from the old system where royal courts served the king's interests rather than abstract justice. But the Constitution's most controversial feature was its distinction between active and passive citizens. Only men who paid taxes equal to 3 days' wages could vote in elections. This excluded roughly 1/3 of adult males from political participation. Women were excluded entirely regardless of their wealth or education. The property requirement reflected the delegates' fear of mob rule. They had witnessed crowd violence during the storming of the Bastille and peasant revolts. They worried that poor people would vote irresponsibly if given political power. Property ownership supposedly demonstrated the stability and judgment necessary for citizenship. Passive citizens retained all the rights listed in the Declaration of Rights. They could not be arrested arbitrarily or denied freedom of speech, but they could not participate directly in choosing their representatives. This created two classes of citizenship that violated the principle of equality before the law. The distinction between active and passive citizens generated enormous controversy. Radical journalists like Jean-Paul Marat attacked it as a betrayal of revolutionary principles. "What is the nation?" he asked. "It is the mass of individuals who compose it. What is the sovereign? It is not a portion of the nation, it is the nation itself." Defenders of the property requirement argued that universal suffrage was dangerous and impractical. Most common people lacked the education necessary to make informed political choices. Wealthy citizens had demonstrated their ability to manage affairs responsibly. They deserved more influence over government decisions. The debate over voting rights revealed fundamental tensions within revolutionary ideology. The Declaration of Rights proclaimed that all men were equal. But equality of rights did not necessarily mean equality of political participation. Some revolutionaries wanted to limit democracy while expanding liberty. The Constitution of 1791 also addressed the difficult question of religious authority. The Civil Constitution of the Clergy, passed in July 1790, made the Catholic Church a department of the state. Bishops and priests became civil servants paid by the government rather than independent religious authorities. This provision seemed logical to assembly delegates who wanted to create a unified, rational state. The Church owned vast wealth that could help solve France's financial crisis. Religious authorities had long meddled in politics and supported royal oppression. Bringing them under government control would eliminate these problems. But the Civil Constitution created a massive religious crisis that split French Catholics into opposing camps. The Pope condemned the new arrangement as an attack on church independence. About half of French priests refused to take the required oath of loyalty to the Civil Constitution. This religious schism had profound political consequences. Catholics who supported the traditional church became enemies of the revolution. Rural areas where non-juring priests were popular turned against revolutionary authorities. The Assembly had inadvertently created a powerful counter-revolutionary movement. The Constitution also established a complex system of local government. France was divided into 83 departments of roughly equal size. These departments replaced the old provinces with their ancient privileges and traditions. Each department was subdivided into districts and communes with elected officials. This administrative revolution was intended to create national unity and efficient government. The old system of overlapping jurisdictions and competing authorities would be replaced by clear, rational structures. Citizens would know exactly which officials were responsible for different governmental functions. But the new administrative system also eliminated regional identities that had existed for centuries. Brittany, Normandy, and Languedoc disappeared as political entities. Their distinct legal traditions and cultural practices were swept away in favour of national uniformity. The Constitution of 1791 represented the moderate phase of the French Revolution. It sought to preserve monarchy while limiting royal power. It expanded liberty while restricting democracy. It promoted equality while maintaining property distinctions. These compromises satisfied few people completely. King Louis XVI accepted the constitution reluctantly in September 1791. He had little choice given his weakened position, but he never truly embraced constitutional government. He constantly looked for opportunities to restore his former power. His half-hearted acceptance undermined the constitution's legitimacy from the beginning. Radical revolutionaries criticized the constitution as insufficiently democratic. They wanted universal male suffrage and a republic rather than constitutional monarchy. The property requirements for voting seemed to betray the promise of equality. Constitutional government looked too much like the old regime with minor modifications. Conservative opponents attacked the constitution as dangerous radicalism that would lead to chaos. They argued that limiting royal authority would weaken government effectiveness. Popular participation in politics would create instability and conflict. France needed strong monarchy, not democratic experimentation. The Constitution of 1791 lasted less than a year. War, economic crisis, and political polarization would soon destroy the moderate revolutionary consensus. But it established important precedents for later democratic movements. The idea of written constitutions limiting government power would influence political development across Europe and beyond. King Louis XVI had never truly accepted the revolution. He signed the August decrees under pressure. He approved the Declaration of Rights reluctantly. He accepted the new constitution because he had no alternative. But privately, he dreamed of restoring the old regime and recovering his lost authority. The royal family's situation at the Tuileries Palace had become increasingly uncomfortable. They were virtually prisoners in their own capital. National Guardsmen watched their every move. Hostile crowds gathered outside their windows. Revolutionary newspapers attacked them daily with crude insults and threats. Marie Antoinette particularly hated their new circumstances. She had been raised in the splendour of the Austrian court. The revolution had stripped away her luxury and dignity. She wrote desperate letters to her brother Leopold, the Austrian emperor, begging for foreign intervention to restore royal authority. The Queen convinced her husband that escape was their only hope. If they could reach the frontier, Austrian armies would protect them. From abroad they could rally foreign powers to invade France and crush the revolution. The king could then return in triumph to reclaim his throne. The royal family began planning their escape in early 1791. They contacted Axel von Fersen, a Swedish count who was rumoured to be the Queen's lover. Fersen arranged for a large travelling coach and fresh horses along the escape route. He hired loyal servants to assist the journey. The plan was to travel northeast toward the fortress city of Montmédy near the Luxembourg border. There the Marquis de Bouillé commanded troops who remained loyal to the monarchy. Once safely protected by these soldiers, the king could denounce the revolution and call upon European monarchs for military support. On the night of June 20th, 1791, the royal family began their escape. They disguised themselves as servants of a wealthy Russian noblewoman. The king wore a grey coat and round hat instead of his usual elaborate attire. The queen dressed as a governess. The children pretended to be her charges. The escape began well. The royal family left the Tuileries without being detected by their guards. They met Fersen and the waiting coach outside Paris. For the first time in months they felt free from revolutionary surveillance. The king seemed almost cheerful as their journey began, but problems developed quickly. The large, heavy coach travelled slowly over poor roads. The king insisted on stopping frequently to rest and eat. He seemed to think this was a pleasant excursion rather than a desperate flight from danger. His casual attitude delayed their progress dangerously. Worse, the king's face was too well known for disguise to be effective. His image appeared on paper money and official documents throughout France. Alert citizens began to recognize him despite his common clothes and attempts to avoid attention. At the small town of Sainte-Menehould, the local postmaster named Jean-Baptiste Drouet studied the passengers carefully. The large man in the grey coat looked familiar. When the coach departed, Drouet compared the passenger's face to an image on an assignat, the new revolutionary paper money. Drouet realized he had seen the King of France. He mounted his horse and rode quickly to the next town, Varennes, to warn local authorities. The mayor of Varennes, Jean-Baptiste Sauce, ordered the town gate closed. When the royal coach arrived around 11 o'clock that evening, it could not pass. The royal family was forced to take shelter in Sauce's house while local officials debated what to do. Some wanted to allow the king to continue his journey. Others insisted that he must be returned to Paris immediately. Hours passed while they argued and sent messages to nearby towns. By dawn, word of the king's capture had spread throughout the region. Crowds gathered in Varennes to see the royal prisoners. National Guard units arrived from surrounding communities. The local authorities decided that the king must return to Paris under guard. The journey back to the capital became a humiliating ordeal for the royal family. Hostile crowds lined the roads. People shouted insults and threats. Some threw stones at the coach. The king and queen sat in terrified silence as their subjects expressed years of accumulated anger. News of the king's flight and capture reached Paris on June 22nd. The city erupted in fury. People felt betrayed by a monarch they had tried to trust. They had accepted constitutional monarchy as a compromise. The king's attempted escape proved that he rejected their generosity and wanted to destroy the revolution. The National Assembly faced a crisis of legitimacy. How could they continue to govern with a monarch who had tried to flee the country? How could they maintain constitutional monarchy when the king obviously preferred absolute rule? The flight to Varennes destroyed the careful compromise that the Constitution of 1791 represented. Some assembly members wanted to declare the monarchy abolished and establish a republic immediately. The king had violated his oath to uphold the Constitution. He had attempted treason by seeking foreign intervention against his own people. He had forfeited any claim to continued royal authority, but moderate delegates worried that abolishing the monarchy would radicalize the revolution beyond control. European powers would certainly attack France if it became a republic. Internal stability depended on preserving some continuity with traditional institutions. They argued for maintaining constitutional monarchy despite the king's betrayal. The Assembly chose a face-saving compromise that satisfied no one. They announced that the king had been kidnapped against his will. This obvious fiction allowed them to avoid addressing his obvious disloyalty. Louis XVI was suspended from his duties pending an investigation of the incident, but this compromise fooled no one. Everyone knew the king had tried to escape voluntarily. His return under guard made him appear weak and unreliable. The monarchy's prestige, already damaged by years of revolutionary conflict, suffered a blow from which it never recovered. The flight to Varennes marked the beginning of the revolution's radical phase. Moderate revolutionaries lost credibility when their constitutional compromise collapsed. Radical Republicans gained support by arguing that kings could never be trusted with any power. The dream of peaceful, limited change died on the road to Varennes. The Constitution of 1791 took effect in October 1791. Elections were held throughout France to choose deputies for the new Legislative Assembly. These representatives would govern the country under the constitutional monarchy system. They would test whether the revolution's moderate phase could create stable, effective government. The new assembly was very different from the National Assembly that had written the Constitution. The departing deputies had voted that none of them could serve in the Legislative Assembly. This decision was intended to ensure fresh thinking and prevent the accumulation of too much power by individual politicians. But the exclusion of experienced legislators created serious problems. The new deputies lacked knowledge of parliamentary procedure and political compromise. They did not understand the complex relationships between different revolutionary factions. They arrived in Paris with high ideals but little practical wisdom. The Legislative Assembly quickly divided into three main groups. On the right sat about 160 deputies who supported constitutional monarchy and opposed further revolutionary change. These feuillants, as they were called, represented the interests of wealthy property owners who had benefited from the revolution's early reforms. In the centre sat about 350 deputies who had no firm political allegiances. They voted sometimes with the right and sometimes with the left, depending on the specific issue under consideration. These uncommitted deputies held the balance of power in most legislative decisions. On the left sat about 136 deputies who wanted to continue and deepen the revolutionary transformation of French society. This group included the Girondins, who took their name from the Gironde region around Bordeaux. They were led by brilliant orators like Jacques-Pierre Brissot and supported by influential journalists and political clubs. The Girondins believed that the revolution remained incomplete. The Constitution of 1791 had preserved too much of the old regime. The king still possessed dangerous powers through his suspensive veto. The property requirements for voting excluded too many citizens from political participation. Foreign monarchs threatened to invade France and restore absolute rule. These left-wing deputies also worried about the revolution's internal enemies. Non-juring priests continued to oppose the civil constitution of the clergy. Émigré nobles plotted with foreign powers to destroy the new government. Counter-revolutionary movements were growing in several regions of France. The Girondins proposed aggressive measures to defend the revolution. They wanted to force non-juring priests to take the constitutional oath or face deportation. They demanded harsh penalties for emigrants who collaborated with foreign enemies. Most importantly, they called for war against European monarchs who threatened France. The war issue dominated the Legislative Assembly's debates throughout the winter of 1791-1792. Girondin leaders argued that France could not remain secure while surrounded by hostile monarchies. These foreign rulers would always seek to crush the revolution and restore absolute government throughout Europe. War would also solve the revolution's internal problems, according to Girondin thinking. It would unite all French citizens against external enemies. It would expose traitors who collaborated with foreign powers. It would spread revolutionary principles to oppressed peoples in other countries. War would complete the revolution both at home and abroad. Opposition to war came from unexpected sources. Maximilien Robespierre, a radical lawyer from northern France, argued that war would strengthen counter-revolution rather than weaken it. Internal enemies would use wartime crisis to attack democratic institutions. Foreign invasion would provide excuses for restricting liberty in the name of security. Robespierre also warned that war would benefit ambitious generals who might use military success to seize political power. The revolution had struggled to establish civilian control over the military. Wartime would inevitably strengthen military influence at the expense of democratic government. But Robespierre's warnings were ignored by most deputies. The enthusiasm for war seemed irresistible in the spring of 1792. Even King Louis XVI supported the war policy, though for different reasons than the Girondins. He hoped that military defeat would discredit the revolution and restore his former authority. The Legislative Assembly declared war on Austria on April 20, 1792. Prussia soon joined Austria in opposing France. Other European powers prepared to intervene if the war expanded. The revolution had committed itself to a conflict that would determine its ultimate survival or destruction. But the French military was poorly prepared for war. Many noble officers had emigrated, taking their experience and expertise with them. The army lacked discipline, training, and effective leadership. Revolutionary enthusiasm could not substitute for professional competence on the battlefield. Early military campaigns ended in disaster. French armies retreated in confusion when they encountered Austrian forces. Some units panicked and fled without fighting. Revolutionary generals blamed their defeats on counter-revolutionary sabotage rather than their own incompetence. These military failures created political crisis in Paris. The Girondin government could not explain why the war they had promised would be easy and successful was going so badly. Opposition groups demanded new leadership and more radical measures to defend the revolution. Economic problems made the political situation worse. War disrupted trade and increased government spending dramatically. The value of assignats, the revolutionary paper currency, declined rapidly as people lost confidence in government finances. Food prices rose while wages stagnated. By the summer of 1792, the Legislative Assembly had lost control of the revolutionary situation. Military defeat, Economic crisis and political polarization were undermining constitutional government. The moderate revolution was collapsing under pressures it could not manage. The stage was set for a second, more radical revolution that would sweep away constitutional monarchy entirely. The Legislative Assembly had proven that moderate reform could not satisfy the demands unleashed by revolutionary change. More extreme measures would soon replace the careful compromises of 1791. The war that began in April 1792 quickly became a disaster for France. French armies retreated in panic when they met Austrian forces. Soldiers threw down their weapons and fled. Some units murdered their own officers, suspecting them of treason. The revolution's enemies seemed to be winning everywhere. General Charles Dumouriez led French forces into the Austrian Netherlands. His troops were poorly trained and badly supplied. When Austrian cavalry appeared, entire regiments broke and ran. Dumouriez watched in horror as his army dissolved before his eyes. Years of revolutionary chaos had destroyed military discipline. News of these defeats reached Paris and created panic in the streets. People gathered in coffeehouses and public squares to discuss the crisis. Some blamed the king for secretly helping France's enemies. Others accused emigrant nobles of providing military intelligence to foreign armies. The Brunswick Manifesto arrived in Paris on August 1, 1792. This document changed everything. The Duke of Brunswick commanded the Prussian army advancing toward France. His manifesto threatened terrible revenge if any harm came to the royal family. He promised to destroy Paris if revolutionaries dared to attack the king. The city of Paris and all its inhabitants without exception will be required to submit immediately and without delay to the king, the manifesto declared. Anyone who resisted would be punished according to the most severe laws of war. The document threatened to level Paris and execute anyone who opposed the monarchy. The Brunswick Manifesto was intended to frighten revolutionaries into submission. Instead, it had the opposite effect. Parisians became furious that foreign armies dared to threaten their city. They saw proof that the king was conspiring with France's enemies. The manifesto convinced many moderate citizens that the monarchy had to be destroyed. Revolutionary newspapers published the manifesto with angry commentary. Jean-Paul Marat wrote that it proved the king was a traitor who deserved death. Camille Desmoulins declared that all French people must unite to defend their liberty against foreign tyranny. The press inflamed public opinion to dangerous levels. Popular societies throughout Paris began organizing for resistance. The Jacobin Club met every night to plan defense measures. Neighborhood sections armed their citizens and drilled in public squares. Women formed auxiliary units to support the fighting men. The entire city was transforming into a military camp. The concept of levée en masse began to emerge during this crisis. This meant that all citizens had a duty to defend the nation against invasion. Traditional distinctions between soldiers and civilians would disappear. Everyone would contribute to the war effort according to their abilities. Young men would fight in the armies. Older men would forge weapons and transport supplies. Women would nurse the wounded and make uniforms. Children would gather old cloth for bandages. The entire population would mobilize for total war against France's enemies. This idea was revolutionary in more ways than one. Medieval and ancient warfare had been the business of professional soldiers and noble knights. Common people were expected to stay out of the way while their betters fought. The levée en masse made every citizen a potential warrior. The concept also implied that this was the people's war, not the king's war. Citizens would fight to defend their own liberty and equality, not to preserve royal authority. This transformation of warfare reflected the deeper transformation of political authority that the revolution represented. Economic problems made the military crisis even worse. The government needed enormous amounts of money to equip and supply its armies, but the treasury remained nearly empty. Paper money was losing value rapidly as people lost confidence in revolutionary finances. Food shortages returned to Paris as military demands disrupted normal trade. Grain that might have fed city workers went to supply army units instead. Bread prices rose steadily through the summer of 1792. Hungry people became angry people, ready to blame their suffering on identifiable enemies. The Legislative Assembly seemed powerless to solve these mounting problems. Girondin leaders had promised that war would unite the nation and spread liberty across Europe. Instead, war was dividing France and threatening the revolution's survival. Military defeats discredited the government's competence and judgment. King Louis XVI's behaviour during the crisis convinced many people that he was actively working for France's defeat. He used his constitutional veto power to block emergency measures. He refused to approve the deportation of non-juring priests. He rejected plans to establish a military camp near Paris to defend the capital. The king's vetoes seemed to prove that constitutional monarchy could not function during national emergencies. The constitution gave him power to obstruct government policy, but not responsibility to provide alternative leadership. He could prevent action, but could not compel it. Popular anger focused increasingly on the royal family as the source of France's problems. People began to believe that the monarchy itself was incompatible with liberty and national defence. As long as Louis XVI remained king, he would always place his personal interests above the nation's welfare. Street demonstrations became larger and more threatening through July 1792. Crowds gathered outside the Tuileries Palace to demand that the king withdraw his vetoes. They sang revolutionary songs and shouted slogans calling for the monarchy's abolition. The royal family lived in constant fear of mob violence. The crisis was approaching its climax. Either the king would surrender to revolutionary demands, or revolutionaries would remove him by force. Constitutional monarchy had failed to provide effective leadership during wartime emergency. More radical solutions would soon replace the failed compromise of 1791. August 10th, 1792, dawned hot and humid in Paris. Tension filled the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. For weeks, radical newspapers had called for the monarchy's overthrow. Popular societies had organised their members for action. The Brunswick Manifesto had convinced many citizens that the king was a traitor who must be removed. The insurrection began before sunrise. Armed citizens from the radical sections of Paris marched toward the city centre. They wore the red caps of liberty and carried pikes, muskets, and improvised weapons. These were not wealthy merchants or educated professionals. These were ordinary workers, craftsmen, and small shopkeepers who had embraced revolutionary ideals. The insurgents converged on the Hôtel de Ville, Paris's city hall. They demanded that the municipal government declare the king deposed and call for new elections. Some moderate officials resisted, but they were overwhelmed by popular pressure. A new revolutionary municipality took control of the city government. Meanwhile, other groups of insurgents surrounded the Tuileries Palace where the royal family lived. National Guard units were supposed to protect the monarchy, but many guards sympathized with the revolution. Some abandoned their posts. Others joined the attacking crowds. The palace's defences crumbled from within. King Louis XVI faced an impossible choice. He could order his Swiss Guard to fire on French citizens, which would make him appear tyrannical, or he could surrender without a fight, which would make him appear weak. Either decision would destroy what remained of royal authority. The Queen, Marie Antoinette, urged her husband to resist. She had always possessed more courage and determination than the king. She wanted to die fighting rather than submit to revolutionary humiliation. But Louis XVI lacked the ruthless resolve that desperate situations required. As crowds gathered outside the palace, the royal family sought refuge in the nearby Legislative Assembly. They hoped the constitutional government would protect them from mob violence. This decision proved to be a fatal mistake. By fleeing to the assembly, the king acknowledged that he could not defend himself. The Swiss Guard remained at their posts in the palace even after the royal family departed. These professional soldiers had sworn loyalty to the monarchy. They would not abandon their duty simply because their king had fled. About 900 Swiss troops prepared to defend the empty palace against thousands of attackers. The battle for the Tuileries began around 10 o'clock in the morning. The insurgents charged across the palace courtyard under heavy fire from the Swiss defenders. Bodies fell on both sides as the fighting intensified. Smoke from musket fire obscured the morning sun. The Swiss Guard fought with professional discipline, but they were vastly outnumbered. Waves of attackers swept over their positions. Some defenders retreated into the palace itself and continued fighting room by room. Others tried to escape through the gardens but were hunted down by angry crowds. By noon, the battle was over. Nearly 600 Swiss guards had been killed along with about 400 insurgents. The palace was looted and partially burned. Furniture, paintings, and royal belongings were destroyed or stolen. The monarchy's physical seat of power had been obliterated. The Legislative Assembly voted to suspend Louis XVI from his royal functions. This was a compromise measure that avoided directly deposing the king while acknowledging that he could no longer govern. The Assembly also called for elections to choose a new national convention with broader powers. But suspension was not enough for the radical crowds that controlled the streets. They demanded that the king be imprisoned immediately. They accused him of treason for corresponding with foreign enemies. They wanted him tried and punished like any other criminal. Under popular pressure, the Assembly ordered the royal family imprisoned in the Temple, a medieval fortress in eastern Paris. The king, queen, and their children were confined in small, uncomfortable rooms. They were guarded constantly and denied most of their former privileges. The fall of the monarchy created a power vacuum in France. The Legislative Assembly lacked legitimacy because it had been elected under the constitutional monarchy system. The new revolutionary municipality of Paris claimed to speak for the people, but it represented only one city. During this uncertain period, popular violence erupted again in early September. Rumours spread that imprisoned counter-revolutionaries were planning to escape and join foreign armies. Angry crowds attacked the prisons and massacred more than 1,000 suspected enemies of the revolution. The September massacres revealed the dark side of revolutionary enthusiasm. Ordinary citizens became executioners who killed prisoners without trial or legal procedure. They justified these murders as necessary defense against counter-revolutionary conspiracy. But many victims were common criminals who had no political connections. The psychology of revolutionary violence was complex and disturbing. People who were normally peaceful neighbours became bloodthirsty killers when caught up in crowd dynamics. Fear of enemies combined with political excitement to create temporary madness that shocked even participants afterward. Some revolutionary leaders like Marat encouraged the massacres as expressions of popular justice. Others like Robespierre condemned the violence while understanding its political causes. The revolutionary government made little effort to stop the killings, fearing that intervention would turn the crowds against them. News of the September massacres spread across Europe and horrified foreign observers. They saw confirmation that the French Revolution was degenerating into barbarous chaos. European governments became even more determined to intervene militarily to prevent revolutionary madness from spreading. But the massacres also served revolutionary purposes by eliminating potential opposition and intimidating remaining enemies. Counter-revolutionaries throughout France understood that they faced death if they openly opposed the new regime. The violence created a climate of fear that silenced dissent. The fall of the monarchy and the September massacres marked the end of the revolution's moderate phase. Constitutional government and legal procedures had been swept aside by popular force. The radical revolution was beginning, and no one knew where it would lead. Elections for the National Convention took place in September 1792 amid military crisis and domestic upheaval. Foreign armies were advancing toward Paris. The monarchy had collapsed. Political authority was fragmenting. French voters faced the enormous task of choosing representatives to guide the nation through revolutionary chaos. The electoral system was more democratic than any France had previously experienced. All adult males could vote regardless of property ownership. The distinction between active and passive citizens that had limited democracy under the Constitution of 1791 was abandoned. For the first time, French democracy truly represented the entire male population. But the crisis atmosphere meant that elections could not be conducted normally. Many moderate citizens stayed away from polling places, fearing violence or intimidation. Radical activists dominated the electoral process in many regions. The convention would be more extreme than the general population it claimed to represent. Only about 10% of eligible voters actually participated in the elections. This low turnout reflected the chaotic conditions throughout France. People were more concerned with immediate survival than with choosing representatives. The convention's legitimacy would always be questionable given this limited popular participation. The new convention contained 749 deputies representing every region of France. Most were lawyers, doctors, and other educated professionals from the middle class. Very few actual workers or peasants were elected despite the democratic electoral system. Revolutionary politics remained dominated by educated elites, even as it claimed to represent common people. Political divisions within the convention quickly became apparent. On the right sat about 160 Girondins, who favoured moderate policies and decentralised government. They represented commercial interests and feared that radical measures would destroy economic stability. Their leaders included eloquent orators like Jacques-Pierre Brissot and Pierre-Victorien Vergniaud. On the left sat about 200 Jacobins who demanded more radical changes and centralised revolutionary government. They had close connections to the popular societies of Paris and other cities. Their most prominent leaders were Maximilien Robespierre, known as the Incorruptible for his moral rigidity, and Louis-Antoine Saint-Just, a brilliant young lawyer with aristocratic features and republican convictions. Between these organised factions sat about 390 deputies who belonged to no particular group. They were called the Plain or the Marsh because they occupied the lower seats in the convention hall. These uncommitted deputies held the balance of power on most issues. Their votes would determine which faction controlled the revolutionary government. The convention's first major decision was what to do about the monarchy. The Girondins wanted to preserve the institution while replacing Louis XVI with a more suitable king. The Jacobins demanded that monarchy be abolished entirely and France become a republic. The debate revealed fundamental disagreements about the revolution's ultimate goals. On September 21, 1792, the convention voted unanimously to abolish the monarchy. The next day they declared that France was now a republic. These decisions represented the most radical step the revolution had taken so far. For the first time in over 1,000 years, France would be governed without a king. The establishment of the French Republic had enormous symbolic importance throughout Europe. It proved that alternatives to monarchy were possible in practice, not just in theory. Republican government had existed in small city-states, but never in a large, powerful nation. France was providing a model that could be copied elsewhere, but the convention faced enormous practical problems that symbolic gestures could not solve. Foreign armies were still advancing toward Paris. The economy remained in crisis. Counter-revolutionary opposition was growing in several regions. The new republic needed effective government, not just inspiring rhetoric. The power struggle between Girondins and Jacobins intensified as these problems mounted. Girondins blamed Jacobin extremism for foreign hostility and domestic violence. They argued that moderate policies would restore stability and allow peaceful development of democratic institutions. Jacobins blamed Girondin weakness for military defeats and counter-revolutionary success. They argued that revolutionary government required extraordinary measures to defend liberty against its enemies. Half-hearted policies would allow the Republic's enemies to destroy it before it could establish itself firmly. Saint-Just emerged as the most influential Jacobin theorist during this period. Though only 25 years old, he possessed remarkable intellectual clarity and ruthless determination. He argued that revolutionary government could not operate according to normal legal procedures. The provisional government of France is revolutionary until the peace, he declared. This concept of revolutionary government would have enormous consequences. It suggested that emergency conditions justified suspending normal rights and procedures. Liberty could be preserved only by temporarily limiting liberty. Democracy required the temporary suppression of democratic opposition. Robespierre provided the moral authority that gave Jacobin policies their appeal. His personal incorruptibility was legendary even among his enemies. He lived simply, accepted no bribes, and seemed motivated entirely by dedication to revolutionary principles. His speeches combined practical politics with moral philosophy in ways that inspired devoted followers. The struggle between factions was complicated by France's federal structure. Paris dominated national politics, but the provinces had their own interests and perspectives. Many regional leaders supported Girondin policies that would limit central authority and preserve local autonomy. The convention also faced the practical challenge of governing without established institutions. The old royal administration had been dismantled. New revolutionary structures were still being created. Government officials often lacked experience and expertise. The machinery of state was breaking down just when effective action was most urgently needed. Economic problems continued to worsen throughout late 1792. Military spending consumed enormous resources, while trade disruption reduced government revenues. Paper money was losing value rapidly. Food shortages appeared in many cities. The revolution was failing to provide the prosperity it had promised. These mounting crises would force the convention to choose between Girondin moderation and Jacobin extremism. Compromise was becoming impossible as problems intensified. One faction would eventually gain control and impose its vision on the Republic. The choice would determine whether the revolution remained democratic or became dictatorial. The question of what to do with Louis XVI divided the National Convention more bitterly than any other issue. The former king sat imprisoned in the Temple, while deputies debated his fate. Some wanted him tried as a traitor. Others argued for exile or imprisonment. A few still hoped for restoration under a new constitution. The discovery of the iron chest in November 1792 changed the political situation dramatically. This secret compartment in the Tuileries Palace contained the king's correspondence with foreign powers. The letters proved that Louis XVI had encouraged Austrian and Prussian intervention against his own people. The evidence seemed overwhelming. The king had secretly opposed the revolution while publicly accepting the constitution. He had provided military intelligence to France's enemies. He had hoped for foreign invasion to restore his absolute authority. These actions clearly constituted treason under any reasonable definition, but legal questions remained complex. Could the king be tried like an ordinary citizen when he had enjoyed constitutional immunity? Did the convention have authority to conduct criminal trials? What laws applied to someone who had been above the law until recently? The deputies struggled with unprecedented legal and philosophical problems. Saint-Just addressed these questions in a famous speech that defined Jacobin thinking. "The king must be judged as an enemy," he declared. Louis XVI was not a citizen who could claim legal protections. He was a foreign prince who had made war on the French people. He could be executed as an enemy combatant without formal trial. This argument shocked moderate deputies who believed in legal procedures and constitutional government. They insisted that even kings deserved fair trials with proper evidence and legal representation. Revolutionary government should demonstrate its commitment to justice by following lawful procedures. Robespierre supported Saint-Just's position with different reasoning. He argued that putting the king on trial would be a political mistake. It would imply that his guilt was questionable and require proof of crimes. But monarchy itself was the crime. The king's existence threatened republican government regardless of his personal actions. The king must die so that the nation may live, Robespierre declared. This was not about personal vengeance, but about political necessity. As long as Louis XVI lived, royalists could hope for restoration. Foreign powers would consider him the legitimate ruler of France. The Republic would never be secure until the monarchy was completely destroyed. The convention voted in December 1792 to try the former king before the assembled deputies. This compromise satisfied neither the Jacobins, who wanted immediate execution, nor the Girondins, who preferred exile or imprisonment. but it allowed the convention to maintain unity while addressing the king's fate. The trial began on December 11, 1792. Louis XVI appeared before the convention to answer charges of treason and conspiracy against public liberty. He was allowed legal counsel and given time to prepare his defence. The proceedings followed formal judicial procedures despite their unprecedented nature. The king's defence was managed by Raymond Decize, an experienced lawyer who argued courageously for his dangerous client. Decize insisted that Louis XVI had acted within his constitutional rights, as they were understood at the time. The king had committed no crimes that were clearly illegal when he performed the actions in question. This defence highlighted the complexity of judging revolutionary situations. Laws and constitutions had changed repeatedly during the previous 4 years. Actions that seemed reasonable under one system appeared treasonous under another. How could anyone be held responsible for violating rules that did not exist when they acted? The king himself maintained dignity throughout the trial proceedings. He answered questions calmly and denied charges of deliberate treason. He claimed that he had always acted in what he believed were France's best interests. His personal behaviour impressed even some opponents, but the political momentum for execution proved irresistible. The convention was under enormous pressure from radical sections of Paris. Crowds gathered daily outside the assembly hall, demanding death for the tyrant. Any deputy who voted for mercy risked being accused of counter-revolutionary sympathies. The voting took place in January 1793 over several days. First, the deputies voted overwhelmingly that Louis XVI was guilty of the charges against him. Then they voted on the appropriate punishment. The final tally was 387 votes for death versus 334 for alternative punishments. A margin of just 53 votes determined the king's fate. Many deputies who voted for execution did so reluctantly. They believed that royal death was politically necessary even if they found it morally troubling. The revolution had reached a point where compromise was impossible. Either the monarchy would be destroyed completely, or it would eventually destroy the Republic. Louis XVI learned of his death sentence with apparent calm. He spent his final days writing letters to his family and preparing for death. He met with a priest who had taken the constitutional oath and received religious comfort. His dignity in these final hours impressed even his enemies. The execution was scheduled for January 21, 1793, in the Place de la Révolution, formerly the Place Louis XV. Thousands of Parisians gathered to witness the event. National Guard units surrounded the scaffold to prevent any rescue attempt. The crowd was surprisingly quiet and subdued. The king mounted the scaffold with steady steps. He attempted to address the crowd but was drowned out by drum rolls ordered by the military commanders. He was quickly positioned under the guillotine blade. The execution was completed within minutes. The crowd erupted in cheers as the king's head was displayed. News of Louis XVI's execution shocked Europe and eliminated any possibility of compromise with foreign powers. European monarchs could not tolerate the precedent of a king being tried and executed by his subjects. They would fight to the death to prevent such dangerous ideas from spreading. The execution also divided French opinion more deeply than ever before. Supporters saw it as necessary justice for centuries of oppression. Opponents viewed it as regicide that violated religious law and natural order. The revolution had crossed a line from which there could be no return. The psychological impact of the king's death was enormous. For over 1,000 years, French people had lived under monarchy. Kings had been sacred figures who connected earth to heaven. Their execution broke an ancient compact between rulers and ruled that could never be restored. The convention had chosen the path of complete revolution over gradual reform. There would be no compromise with the old regime, no constitutional monarchy, no peaceful coexistence between traditional and revolutionary authority. The Republic would triumph completely or be destroyed in the attempt. The radical revolution attempted to reshape every aspect of French life. Political change was not enough. The revolutionaries wanted to create an entirely new society based on reason, equality, and virtue. This ambitious program touched economics, religion, culture, and even the measurement of time itself. Economic crisis forced the convention to abandon free market principles that had guided earlier revolutionary policy. Food shortages continued to plague French cities. Bread prices rose faster than wages. Urban workers faced starvation, while merchants seemed to profit from scarcity. Popular pressure demanded government intervention in the economy. The Law of the Maximum, passed in September 1793, established price controls on essential goods. Bread, meat, wine, and other necessities could not be sold above fixed prices set by local authorities. Merchants who violated these controls faced severe penalties, including imprisonment or death. The maximum represented a fundamental shift in revolutionary thinking about property rights. Earlier revolutionaries had considered property sacred and inviolable. The Declaration of Rights had protected property as a natural right, but emergency conditions required sacrificing property rights to preserve the revolution itself. Implementation of price controls created enormous practical problems. Merchants often refused to sell goods at the fixed prices. They claimed that government prices did not cover their costs. Some closed their shops or moved their inventory to areas with higher prices. Black markets flourished as people paid premium prices for goods they needed. The government responded to merchant resistance with increasing severity. Special commissioners were sent to enforce price controls. Revolutionary tribunals tried merchants accused of hoarding or speculation. The death penalty was applied to economic crimes that had previously carried minor punishments. These harsh measures reflected the revolutionaries' belief that economic problems resulted from counter-revolutionary conspiracy rather than natural market forces. They assumed that adequate supplies existed if only selfish merchants could be forced to sell at fair prices. Economic theory took second place to political necessity. Land redistribution became another major revolutionary goal. The convention seized all property belonging to the Catholic Church and emigrant nobles. These national lands were sold at auction to raise revenue for the government. The sales were intended to create a class of small property owners loyal to the revolution, but most peasants could not afford to buy land at auction prices. Wealthy merchants and middle-class professionals purchased most of the national lands. Rural inequality persisted despite the revolutionaries' equalitarian rhetoric. The land redistribution program failed to achieve its social goals. The convention also attempted to transform French culture and society according to revolutionary principles. They created a new calendar that eliminated Christian references and emphasized reason over religion. Year Eye of the Republic began on September 22, 1792. Months received new names like Thermidor and Fructidor that reflected natural phenomena rather than Roman gods or Christian saints. Each month contained 3 10-day weeks called decades. The traditional 7-day week with its religious associations was abolished. Every 10th day was a rest day dedicated to revolutionary festivals and civic education. The new calendar was intended to break the rhythm of Christian life that had structured French society for centuries. Revolutionary festivals replaced Christian holidays as focal points of community life. The Festival of Reason celebrated human intelligence over religious superstition. The Festival of the Supreme Being honored a vague deist conception of divinity. These ceremonies attempted to create new traditions that would bind citizens to the Republic. The festivals featured elaborate pageants designed by artists like Jacques-Louis David. Citizens dressed in classical costumes and participated in choreographed ceremonies that resembled ancient Greek rituals more than Christian worship. These events were intended to educate the people about Republican virtues and revolutionary values. The dechristianization campaign represented the most radical aspect of cultural transformation. Revolutionary authorities closed churches and arrested priests who refused the constitutional oath. Religious symbols were removed from public buildings. Christian art was destroyed or hidden. The Cathedral of Notre Dame was converted into a temple of reason. Some revolutionaries promoted the worship of reason as a substitute for Christianity. Reason was personified as a goddess who could provide moral guidance without the superstitions of organized religion. Rational thought would replace faith as the foundation of social order. But dechristianization created enormous popular resistance, especially in rural areas. Most French people remained devoutly Catholic despite revolutionary propaganda. They viewed attacks on religion as attacks on their deepest beliefs and traditions. The policy alienated many citizens who might otherwise have supported the Republic. Robespierre eventually recognized that de-Christianization was politically counterproductive. He promoted the worship of the Supreme Being as a compromise between atheism and traditional Christianity. This vague deism was intended to preserve moral order while eliminating clerical influence. The attempt to reshape French society revealed both the power and the limitations of revolutionary government. Political authority could change laws and institutions relatively quickly, but transforming popular beliefs and customs required much more time and patience than the revolutionaries possessed. Many of the cultural innovations disappeared as soon as the radical phase of the revolution ended. The revolutionary calendar was abandoned under Napoleon. Christian festivals returned to mark the rhythm of French life. Churches reopened and resumed their traditional functions, but some changes proved more lasting. The metric system of weights and measures, introduced during this period, eventually spread throughout the world. The principle of civil marriage independent of religious ceremony became standard practice. Public education expanded dramatically and remained largely secular. The economic policies of the Radical Revolution had mixed results. Price controls helped urban workers afford basic necessities during crisis periods, but they also disrupted normal trade patterns and created shortages. The maximum was eventually abandoned when its costs exceeded its benefits. The sale of national lands did create a new class of property owners, though not exactly as the revolutionaries intended. These buyers became conservative supporters of property rights and opponents of further radical change. Their economic interests aligned with political stability rather than continued revolution. The Radical Revolution's attempt at total transformation ultimately proved impossible. Human societies could not be completely remade according to abstract principles within a few years. The revolutionaries' ambitious goals exceeded their practical capabilities and popular support, but the effort itself was historically significant. It demonstrated that traditional institutions and beliefs were not eternal or unchangeable. Human beings could consciously reshape their societies if they possessed sufficient will and determination. This lesson would inspire future revolutionary movements around the world. The Convention struggled to govern France during the spring of 1793. Military defeats continued along the frontiers. Counter-revolutionary revolts spread through several regions. Economic crisis deepened in the cities. The Republic seemed to be collapsing under the weight of external war and internal rebellion. Traditional government institutions could not cope with these multiple crises. The Convention met only periodically and included too many members for quick decision-making. Ministers changed frequently and lacked continuity in their policies. France needed stronger, more centralized leadership to survive the revolutionary emergency. On April 6, 1793, the Convention created the Committee of Public Safety to coordinate the government's response to national crisis. This committee of 12 men would exercise executive authority while remaining responsible to the Convention. They would serve terms of only 1 month to prevent the accumulation of too much power. The Committee of Public Safety began as a moderate institution dominated by Girondin politicians, but military disasters and popular pressure gradually shifted power toward more radical members. By July 1793, Jacobins controlled the committee and used it to implement increasingly extreme policies. Maximilien Robespierre joined the Committee of Public Safety on July 27, 1793. His appointment marked the beginning of the most radical phase of the French Revolution. Robespierre brought moral authority and political skill that transformed the committee into the engine of revolutionary government. Robespierre was known throughout France as the Incorruptible because of his personal integrity and dedication to revolutionary principles. He lived simply in a modest apartment and accepted no bribes or special favors. He seemed motivated entirely by abstract ideals rather than personal ambition or material gain. But Robespierre's moral purity was accompanied by inflexible rigidity that brooked no compromise with enemies of the revolution. He believed that liberty could be preserved only through the complete destruction of all opposition to republican government. Half measures and moderation would allow counter-revolution to succeed. Terror is nothing but justice, prompt, severe, and inflexible, Robespierre declared in a famous speech. It is therefore an emanation of virtue. This paradoxical statement captured the essence of Jacobin thinking during the radical period. Violence in defense of liberty was not only justified but morally required. Louis-Antoine Saint-Just provided the intellectual framework for revolutionary government. Though only 26 years old, he possessed remarkable clarity of thought and ruthless determination. His speeches combined classical learning with revolutionary passion in ways that inspired and terrified his audiences. Saint-Just argued that revolutionary government could not operate according to normal legal procedures. The provisional government of France is revolutionary until the peace, he explained. Emergency conditions justified extraordinary measures that would be unacceptable during normal times. This concept of revolutionary government had enormous implications. It meant that constitutional rights could be suspended indefinitely. Legal protections for accused persons could be eliminated. Political opposition could be treated as treason punishable by death. The revolution would use dictatorial methods to preserve democratic principles. Saint-Just became known as the Angel of Death because of his role in ordering mass executions. He spoke with calm eloquence about the necessity of eliminating enemies of the people. His youth and aristocratic features made his bloodthirsty rhetoric even more chilling to observers. The Committee of Public Safety developed an efficient administrative system for implementing the terror. Representatives on mission were sent to the provinces with unlimited authority to suppress counter-revolution. They could arrest suspects, confiscate property, and order executions without interference from local authorities. The Revolutionary Tribunal was reorganized to process cases more rapidly. Complex legal procedures were simplified or eliminated entirely. Accused persons received minimal opportunities to defend themselves. The tribunal became a machine for converting political suspects into executed enemies of the people. Local surveillance committees were established in every neighborhood to monitor citizen behavior and report suspicious activities. These committees consisted of ordinary people who were encouraged to denounce their neighbors for counter-revolutionary thoughts or actions. The entire population was mobilized to police itself. The law of suspects, passed in September 1793, defined counter-revolution so broadly that almost anyone could be arrested. Former nobles, relatives of emigrants, critics of government policy, and even people who showed insufficient enthusiasm for the revolution could be imprisoned without trial. This legal framework created a climate of fear that paralyzed opposition to the revolutionary government. People were afraid to express dissenting opinions or associate with suspected persons. Self-censorship became the norm as citizens tried to avoid attracting official attention. The Committee of Public Safety justified these extreme measures by pointing to the genuine threats facing the Republic. Foreign armies were invading French territory. Counter-revolutionary rebellions controlled large regions. Economic sabotage was disrupting essential supplies. The revolution was fighting for its survival against powerful enemies, but the machinery of terror created its own momentum that became independent of external threats. The committee needed to identify new enemies constantly to justify continued emergency powers. Political competition within the revolutionary movement was redefined as counter-revolutionary conspiracy. Robespierre and his colleagues genuinely believed they were saving liberty by destroying its enemies. They saw themselves as virtuous republicans protecting the people against aristocratic oppression. Their sincerity made them even more dangerous than cynical tyrants who recognized their own corruption. The Committee of Public Safety succeeded in mobilizing France's resources for total war against external enemies. Military production increased dramatically. New armies were organized and equipped. Revolutionary enthusiasm compensated for professional military expertise. France began winning battles against the European coalition, but internal success came at an enormous cost in human lives and political freedom. The machinery of terror consumed thousands of innocent people, along with genuine counter-revolutionaries. The revolution was devouring its own supporters in the name of preserving revolutionary purity. The revolutionary government faced real threats from counter-revolutionary opposition. But paranoia and suspicion transformed every criticism into treason and every mistake into sabotage. The line between genuine security concerns and imaginary conspiracies became increasingly blurred as the terror intensified. The Vendée Rebellion in western France represented the most serious internal challenge to revolutionary authority. This overwhelmingly Catholic region had never fully accepted the revolution. The civil constitution of the clergy created particular resentment because it attacked traditional religious practices that formed the foundation of rural life. The rebellion began in March 1793 when the Convention ordered military conscription throughout France. Young men in the Vendée refused to serve in armies fighting against Catholic Austria and Spain. They formed guerrilla bands that attacked revolutionary officials and supported non-juring priests. The Vendéan rebels called themselves the Catholic and Royal Army. They fought under white banners emblazoned with religious symbols. Their leaders included noble officers who had remained in France and charismatic peasants who commanded local respect. They received some assistance from British agents and emigrant nobles. Revolutionary forces initially underestimated the Vendéan threat. They assumed that a few thousand peasants could not resist the Republic's military power. But the rebels knew their local terrain intimately and enjoyed popular support. They inflicted several defeats on Republican armies sent to suppress them. The government response escalated from police action to total war. General Jean-Baptiste Carrier was sent to Nantes with orders to pacify the region by any means necessary. His troops destroyed villages suspected of supporting the rebellion. They executed prisoners without trial and terrorized the civilian population. The drowning at Nantes became symbolic of revolutionary brutality. Carrier ordered prisoners loaded onto barges that were then sunk in the Loire River. Hundreds of people drowned in these mass executions. The revolutionary government justified such measures as necessary responses to counter-revolutionary violence. The Vendée War consumed enormous resources and created lasting bitterness between revolutionary and traditional France. Over 100,000 people died in the fighting. Entire villages were destroyed. The region's economy was devastated. The conflict demonstrated that the revolution could not unite all French people under republican government. The siege of Toulon made Napoleon Bonaparte's reputation. As a young artillery officer, he developed the strategy that allowed Republican forces to retake the city in December 1793. His success led to rapid promotion and eventually to political power. The revolutionary government also worried constantly about foreign agents operating within France. British gold was supposedly financing counter-revolutionary activities. Austrian spies were allegedly gathering military intelligence. Emigrant nobles were said to be organizing assassination plots against revolutionary leaders. Some of these fears were justified. Foreign governments did support counter-revolutionary movements when possible. British agents did provide money and weapons to rebels in western France. But the extent of foreign influence was greatly exaggerated by revolutionary paranoia. The foreign plot became an explanation for every setback the revolution encountered. Military defeats resulted from treason rather than incompetence. Economic problems were caused by sabotage rather than poor policy. Political opposition reflected foreign influence rather than legitimate disagreement. This conspiracy mentality made rational political discourse impossible. Anyone who criticized government policy could be accused of serving foreign enemies. Moderate voices were silenced by charges of counter-revolutionary sympathy. The revolution lost the ability to correct its own mistakes through open debate. The search for hidden enemies extended into every aspect of French life. Revolutionary authorities examined personal correspondence for evidence of disloyalty. They monitored private conversations in cafes and public places. They investigated the backgrounds of government employees and military officers. Denunciation became a civic duty, as ordinary citizens were encouraged to report suspicious activities. Anonymous accusations led to arrests and imprisonments. People denounced personal enemies by claiming they were counter-revolutionaries. The system of terror fed on private grudges and neighbourhood conflicts. The nobility faced particular suspicion regardless of their actual behaviour. Even nobles who had supported the revolution from the beginning were viewed as potential traitors. Their aristocratic birth was considered evidence of inherent opposition to equality and democracy. Many nobles tried to escape suspicion by adopting exaggerated revolutionary behaviour. They changed their names to eliminate aristocratic titles. They dressed as common citizens and avoided displaying wealth. Some even denounced relatives to prove their republican loyalty. But these efforts rarely succeeded in eliminating suspicion. Revolutionary authorities assumed that noble conversion was insincere. Aristocrats were playing roles to survive rather than genuinely embracing republican principles. Their very attempts to appear loyal were interpreted as evidence of deception. The clergy faced similar suspicions, especially priests who had taken the constitutional oath. Their religious training was considered incompatible with revolutionary values. They were accused of secretly undermining the Republic while publicly supporting it. Many constitutional priests were arrested despite their official loyalty. The paranoid atmosphere poisoned relationships throughout French society. Family members denounced each other. Friends became enemies overnight. Communities that had lived peacefully for generations were torn apart by political suspicions. The revolution was consuming the social bonds that held French society together. The spring and summer of 1794 witnessed the most intense period of revolutionary violence. Executions accelerated dramatically as the Committee of Public Safety expanded its definition of counter-revolutionary crime. What became known as the Great Terror consumed thousands of victims within a few months. The Revolutionary Tribunal streamlined its procedures to process cases more rapidly. The Law of 22 Prairial, passed in June 1794, eliminated most remaining legal protections for accused persons. Defence lawyers were forbidden. Witnesses for the defence could not be called. The tribunal could convict based on moral conviction without material evidence. These procedural changes transformed trials into brief formalities that almost always ended in death sentences. Prisoners appeared before the tribunal in the morning and were executed in the afternoon of the same day. Justice became an assembly line that converted political suspects into corpses with mechanical efficiency. The tribunal's president, Antoine Fouquier-Tinville, became the face of revolutionary justice. He was a harsh man who showed no mercy to prisoners and no doubt about the righteousness of his work. He processed cases with bureaucratic efficiency and seemed to take pride in the number of executions he ordered. Fouquier-Tinville received lists of prisoners from the Committee of Public Safety with instructions to find them guilty. He rarely questioned these orders or investigated cases independently. His role was to provide legal cover for political decisions made by revolutionary leaders. The tribunal created categories of crimes that encompassed almost any behaviour the government disliked. Conspiracy against liberty could include private criticism of government policy. Intelligence with enemies of the people might mean corresponding with relatives who had emigrated. Corruption of public morals covered a wide range of personal conduct. Daily life in Paris became dominated by fear and uncertainty. People woke each morning wondering if they would be arrested before nightfall. They monitored their words and actions constantly to avoid attracting official attention. Normal social relationships became strained by mutual suspicion. The guillotine operated every day in the Place de la Révolution, formerly the Place Louis XV. Crowds gathered to watch the executions as a form of popular entertainment. Vendors sold food and drink to spectators. Children played games imitating the scaffold. Death became normalized through repetition and ritual. Some spectators brought knitting to occupy themselves during the lengthy proceedings. These tricoteuses, knitting women, became symbols of the revolution's casual attitude toward mass execution. They cheered each death and mocked prisoners as they mounted the scaffold, but other Parisians began to show signs of psychological exhaustion from constant exposure to violence. The initial enthusiasm for revolutionary justice gave way to numb acceptance and even revulsion. People started to avoid the execution ground and question the necessity of so much blood. The psychology of denunciation revealed disturbing aspects of human nature under extreme conditions. Ordinary citizens became informers who destroyed their neighbours' lives for trivial reasons. Personal grudges were transformed into political accusations. Private jealousies became public executions. Some denunciations resulted from genuine ideological conviction. True believers in revolutionary principles reported people they considered enemies of the Republic. They saw themselves as virtuous citizens protecting liberty from its opponents. But many denunciations reflected baser motives. Business rivals accused each other of counter-revolutionary activities. Rejected suitors denounced women who had spurned them. Tenants reported landlords to avoid paying rent. The machinery of terror provided weapons for settling private scores. The atmosphere of suspicion invaded private homes and family relationships. Parents feared that their children might repeat dangerous conversations they overheard. Children learned to distrust adults who expressed forbidden opinions. Husbands and wives monitored each other's words and associations. Revolutionary authorities encouraged this mutual surveillance by rewarding successful denunciators. People who identified genuine counter-revolutionaries received praise and sometimes material benefits. The government created incentives for citizens to spy on each other. The number of executions rose steadily through 1794. In October 1793, the tribunal had ordered about 10 executions per week. By June 1794, the rate had increased to nearly 20 per day. The machinery of terror was accelerating beyond the control of its creators. Prisons throughout Paris overflowed with suspects awaiting trial. The Conciergerie, Sainte-Pélagie and other facilities held thousands of prisoners in crowded, unsanitary conditions. Many died of disease before they could be executed. The entire judicial system became a vast apparatus for processing human beings toward death. The social composition of victims changed as the terror progressed. Initially, most executions targeted obvious counter-revolutionaries like non-juring priests and former nobles. But gradually, the terror began consuming middle-class revolutionaries and even some Jacobin leaders. This expansion of victims reflected the revolution's increasing paranoia about internal enemies. As external military threats diminished, the Committee of Public Safety needed to find new justifications for continued emergency powers. They discovered conspiracies everywhere they looked because they needed conspiracies to exist. The terror also began consuming itself as rival revolutionary factions denounced each other. The Hepatists, who advocated extreme dechristianization policies, were executed in March 1794. The Dantonists, who called for moderation and an end to the terror, followed them to the guillotine in April. These executions of prominent revolutionaries shocked many people who had supported the radical government. If dedicated republicans like Georges Danton and Camille Desmoulins could be condemned as traitors, who was safe? The terror was beginning to devour the revolution's own children. Robespierre himself began to show signs of psychological strain from the burden of ordering so many deaths. He suffered from illness and withdrew from public appearances for weeks at a time. When he returned, he seemed increasingly isolated and paranoid about plots against his own life. The acceleration of executions during the Great Terror served no clear political purpose. France's military situation had improved dramatically by 1794. Foreign armies were being pushed back across the frontiers. Internal rebellions had been largely suppressed. The Republic was no longer in immediate danger of destruction, but the machinery of terror had developed its own momentum independent of external circumstances. Revolutionary leaders found it easier to eliminate opposition than to engage in political debate. Violence had become a habit that was difficult to break. The Committee of Public Safety attempted to create an entirely new culture that would support Republican government and revolutionary values. They understood that political change was not enough. The hearts and minds of French citizens had to be transformed to ensure the revolution's permanent success. Traditional Catholic festivals were replaced by revolutionary celebrations designed to educate the people about republican virtues. The Festival of Reason honoured human intelligence over religious superstition. The Festival of the Supreme Being acknowledged a vague deist conception of divinity while rejecting organised Christianity. These festivals featured elaborate pageants designed by Jacques-Louis David, the revolution's official artist. Citizens dressed in classical costumes and participated in choreographed ceremonies that resembled ancient Greek rituals more than Christian worship. The events were intended to create new traditions that would bind the people to the Republic. The Festival of the Supreme Being on June 8, 1794, represented the pinnacle of revolutionary cultural engineering. Robespierre himself presided over the ceremony as the elected president of the convention. He delivered speeches about virtue and morality, while surrounded by symbols of republican government. The festival began at dawn with processions throughout Paris. Citizens gathered in neighbourhood groups and marched toward the Champ de Mars carrying banners and singing revolutionary songs. Mothers carried bouquets of flowers, children wore wreaths of oak leaves. The entire city participated in the celebration. At the centre of the festivities stood an artificial mountain constructed for the occasion. At its summit sat a tree of liberty surrounded by classical statues representing republican virtues. Robespierre climbed this mountain to address the assembled crowd about the relationship between morality and politics. The true priest of the Supreme Being is nature itself, Robespierre declared. Its temple is the universe. Its religion is virtue. Its festivals are the joy of a great people assembled beneath its eyes to tie the sweet bonds of universal fraternity. This rhetoric attempted to create a new civil religion for Republican France. Revolutionary art served propaganda purposes while attempting to educate citizens about proper values. David's paintings depicted classical heroes who sacrificed personal interests for public good. The Oath of the Horatii and Brutus condemning his sons provided visual lessons about civic virtue and patriotic duty. Public architecture was redesigned to reflect revolutionary principles. Royal symbols were removed from buildings and replaced with republican emblems. The fleur-de-lis gave way to the liberty cap and fasces. Classical motifs replaced Christian imagery in decoration and sculpture. Street names throughout Paris were changed to honour revolutionary heroes and eliminate aristocratic associations. The Rue Saint-Antoine became the Rue de la Liberté. The Place Royale was renamed the Place des Vosges. Even the names of calendar months received revolutionary transformations. Revolutionary theatre promoted republican values while entertaining the people. Plays like The Friend of the Laws and The Marriage of Figaro criticised aristocratic privilege and celebrated common virtue. Audiences were encouraged to participate by cheering heroes and hissing villains, but the attempt to create revolutionary culture from above had limited success with ordinary people. Many citizens participated in festivals because attendance was required or expected, not because they genuinely embraced the new values. Traditional beliefs persisted despite official propaganda. Religious faith proved particularly resistant to revolutionary transformation. Most French people remained devoutly Catholic despite attacks on organized religion. They continued to baptize their children, seek religious marriage ceremonies, and request last rites for the dying. Underground priests provided these services when official clergy could not. The revolutionary calendar failed to replace traditional timekeeping in popular consciousness. People continued to think in terms of Christian holidays like Christmas and Easter, rather than revolutionary festivals. The 10-day week disrupted established patterns of work and rest without providing adequate compensation. Revolutionary music achieved greater popular acceptance than other cultural innovations. Songs like La Marseillaise and Ça ira became genuinely popular expressions of patriotic sentiment. Citizens sang them spontaneously at political gatherings and social events. The transformation of Paris itself provided a more lasting legacy of revolutionary culture. Ancient medieval quarters were demolished to create broad boulevards suitable for parades and demonstrations. Public spaces were redesigned to accommodate large crowds and political assemblies. Revolutionary symbols became deeply embedded in French national identity even after the radical phase ended. The tricolour flag, the Marseillaise anthem, and the Liberty Cap remained important elements of French political culture. Later governments adopted these symbols while rejecting the terror's violence. Education received particular attention as a means of creating republican citizens for the future. Plans were developed for universal public schooling that would replace religious instruction with civic education. Children would learn about rights and duties rather than religious doctrine. But these educational reforms were never fully implemented during the revolutionary period. The government lacked resources and administrative capacity for such massive undertakings. Most schools continued to operate according to traditional patterns with limited revolutionary content. The attempt to create revolutionary culture revealed both the possibilities and limitations of conscious social engineering. Political authority could mandate certain behaviours and expressions, but it could not easily change private beliefs and values. Cultural transformation required more time and subtlety than revolutionary leaders possessed. Many of the revolution's cultural innovations disappeared quickly after the terror ended. The festival of the Supreme Being was abandoned. Revolutionary theatre gave way to entertainment focused on pleasure rather than political education. The artificial culture created by decree could not compete with traditions rooted in popular experience, but some elements of revolutionary culture became permanent features of modern French society. The principle of secular education remained influential even when specific programs failed. The idea that government should promote civic values through public festivals and ceremonies became accepted practice. By the summer of 1794, opposition to Robespierre and the Terror was growing within the Convention itself. Many deputies feared that they would become the next victims of the accelerating executions. The machinery of revolutionary government was consuming the revolution's own supporters along with its enemies. Military success had eliminated many of the external threats that had justified emergency measures. French armies were pushing foreign forces back across the frontiers. The British fleet was withdrawing from Toulon. Internal rebellions in the Vendée and Lyon had been largely suppressed. France was winning the war, but Robespierre seemed determined to continue the terror indefinitely. He spoke of new conspiracies that required elimination. He identified additional enemies of the people who deserved death. The Committee of Public Safety showed no signs of relaxing its harsh policies despite changing circumstances. Economic conditions were also improving as military production increased and trade resumed. Food shortages that had plagued Paris were ending. The assignat currency was stabilizing. Citizens began to question whether continued emergency measures were necessary for the Republic's survival. Robespierre's own behaviour became increasingly erratic and isolated. He suffered from illness and missed many Committee of Public Safety meetings. When he appeared in public, he seemed paranoid about plots against his life. His speeches became repetitive denunciations of hidden enemies. The speech Robespierre delivered to the Convention on July 26, 1794, a Teths, Thermidor in the revolutionary calendar, proved to be his political death warrant. He attacked unnamed conspirators within the revolutionary government itself. He hinted that some convention members were traitors who deserved punishment. This vague but threatening speech terrified deputies who realized they might be Robespierre's next targets. If the incorruptible could discover treason everywhere, no one was safe from accusation. The convention had to choose between destroying Robespierre or being destroyed by him. A coalition of moderate and radical deputies began forming against Robespierre that evening. They included former supporters who had become alarmed by his extremism and long-time opponents who saw an opportunity to strike. The coalition cut across factional lines and included some surprising allies. Joseph Fouché, a former radical who had implemented brutal policies in Lyon, emerged as one of the conspiracy's organizers. He understood that Robespierre considered him expendable and acted to preserve his own life. Personal survival motivated many participants in the anti-Robespierre coalition. Paul Barras, who would later play important roles during the Directory period, provided crucial military connections. He ensured that National Guard units in Paris would not defend Robespierre if the convention moved against him. Control of armed force was essential for the conspiracy's success. The decisive confrontation occurred on July 27, 1794, 9th Thermidor Year II. When Robespierre attempted to address the convention, he was shouted down by hostile deputies. "Down with the tyrant!" they cried. For the first time in months, someone was preventing the incorruptible from speaking. Robespierre tried repeatedly to defend himself, but was drowned out by the uproar. His voice, which had condemned so many others to death, could not be heard above the chaos. The man who had silenced opposition through terror was now silenced by his own victims. The convention voted to arrest Robespierre, Saint-Just, and their closest associates. This was an unprecedented act of defiance against the Committee of Public Safety. For over a year, the committee's word had been law. Now the convention was asserting its authority over the revolutionary government. News of Robespierre's arrest created panic among his supporters in the Paris municipal government. They ordered the tocsin rung to call citizens to his defence. Armed men gathered in the Hôtel de Ville to protect the fallen leader. Civil war seemed possible as competing authorities claimed legitimacy, but popular support for Robespierre proved weaker than his enemies had expected. The sections of Paris that had supported radical policies remained largely passive. Citizens were exhausted by violence and welcomed the prospect of change. The terror had lost its popular base. Robespierre and his supporters were outlawed when they refused to surrender to convention authorities. This meant they could be executed without trial as enemies of the Republic. The legal protection that the incorruptible had denied to others was now denied to him. The final confrontation occurred at the Hôtel de Ville during the night of 9-10 Thermidor. National Guard units loyal to the convention surrounded the building and demanded surrender. When Robespierre's supporters attempted to resist, gunfire broke out. Robespierre himself was wounded in the jaw, possibly by a suicide attempt. On the afternoon of July 28, 1794, 10 Thermidor, Robespierre and 21 of his associates were executed in the Place de la Révolution. The crowd that gathered to watch showed little sympathy for the fallen leader. The man who had ordered so many deaths faced his own execution with the same guillotine he had used on others. The execution of Robespierre marked the end of the terror and the beginning of what became known as the Thermidorian Reaction. The convention immediately began dismantling the machinery of revolutionary government. The Committee of Public Safety's powers were reduced. The revolutionary tribunal's procedures were reformed to protect accused persons. Prisoners held on political charges were gradually released from overcrowded jails throughout France. Thousands of people who had expected to die instead found themselves free to resume normal lives. The atmosphere of fear and suspicion that had paralyzed French society began to lift. The Thermidorian period represented a reaction against the extremes of revolutionary radicalism. Citizens wanted stability, prosperity, and personal security rather than continued political transformation. The revolution was entering a more conservative phase that would eventually lead to Napoleon's rise to power. But the end of the terror did not mean the end of the revolution's influence. The ideas and institutions created during the radical period would continue to shape French politics for generations. The revolution had demonstrated that ordinary people could change the world when they acted together with sufficient determination. The end of the terror brought relief to French people who had lived in constant fear, but it also created new problems that the revolutionary government struggled to solve. How could France maintain republican institutions without returning to the chaos and violence of the radical period? The answer came in the form of a new constitution that tried to balance liberty with order. The Constitution of Year III was adopted in August 1795 after months of heated debate. The Thermidorian Convention wanted to create a government that could provide stability while preventing any individual or group from gaining too much power. They had learned painful lessons from both royal absolutism and Jacobin dictatorship. The new constitution established a complex system of checks and balances designed to prevent tyranny. Legislative power was divided between two chambers, the Council of 500 and the Council of Elders. The 500 would propose laws. The elders would approve or reject them. Neither chamber could act alone. Executive authority was placed in the hands of a directory consisting of 5 men chosen by the legislature. These directors would serve staggered terms to ensure continuity. They would appoint ministers and oversee government administration. But they could not make laws or control the budget. Power was deliberately fragmented. The constitution also restricted voting rights more severely than previous revolutionary governments had done. Only men who paid substantial taxes could participate in elections. This eliminated most workers and peasants from political participation. The Thermidorians wanted a republic of property owners, not a democracy of all citizens. These constitutional arrangements seemed reasonable in theory, but they created enormous practical problems that paralysed effective government. The two legislative councils constantly disagreed with each other and with the Directory. Laws were proposed, but never passed. Policies were announced, but never implemented. The Directory found itself caught between legislative councils that refused to cooperate and popular movements that demanded immediate action. They could not make decisions quickly enough to address France's urgent problems. The elaborate constitutional machinery ground to a halt whenever crisis required rapid response. Political parties began forming around different approaches to these problems. The moderate Republicans wanted to preserve constitutional government while making it more efficient. The Neo-Jacobins called for returning to more radical policies that would serve popular interests. Constitutional royalists hoped to restore the monarchy under a new constitution, but party politics proved impossible under the Directory's institutional arrangements. The constitution made no provision for organised opposition or loyal dissent. Any criticism of government policy could be interpreted as counter-revolutionary conspiracy. Political competition was driven underground, where it festered and created instability. The first major crisis came in 1795, when royalist uprisings broke out in Paris and other cities. The Vendémiaire revolt on October 5, 1795, brought armed insurgents into the streets of the capital. They demanded the restoration of the monarchy and the elimination of republican government entirely. The Directory called upon military units to suppress the royalist uprising. A young general named Napoleon Bonaparte commanded the artillery that fired grape-shot into the rebel crowds. His decisive action saved the republican government, but also demonstrated the regime's dependence on military force. This pattern would be repeated many times during the Directory period. Civilian authorities could not maintain order through legal means alone. They required military intervention to survive each political crisis. Gradually, the army became more important than the constitution in determining France's political future. The elections of 1797 brought new dangers when royalist candidates won majorities in many districts. These electoral victories reflected popular exhaustion with revolutionary upheaval and desire for stability. But they also threatened to overturn the Republic through legal means rather than violent rebellion. The Directory faced an impossible choice. They could accept the electoral results and allow royalists to gain control of the legislature. This might lead to the peaceful restoration of monarchy, or they could annul the elections and preserve republican government through illegal means. They chose the second option in the coup of 18 Fructidor, September 4, 1797. Military forces surrounded the legislative councils and arrested royalist deputies. The elections in 49 departments were declared invalid. Many royalist politicians were deported to harsh exile in South America without trial. The Fructidor coup saved the Republic but destroyed its constitutional legitimacy. The Directory had proven that it would violate its own laws rather than accept unwelcome electoral results. Citizens learned that voting meant nothing if the government disliked the outcome. Similar coups followed in 1798 and 1799 as different factions tried to gain control of the government through force rather than persuasion. The coup of 30 Prairial June 18, 1799, removed Jacobin sympathizers from the Directory. Political power changed hands through military intervention rather than constitutional procedures. Each coup weakened respect for law and increased reliance on force. The Directory was caught in a vicious cycle where illegal actions created problems that required more illegal actions to solve. Constitutional government was destroying itself through repeated violations of constitutional principles. Public confidence in Republican institutions collapsed as corruption scandals plagued the Directory throughout its existence. Directors enriched themselves through government contracts and insider trading. Ministers sold appointments to the highest bidders. The regime that claimed to represent virtue and citizenship became synonymous with corruption and self-interest. The Directory's political instability reflected deeper problems in French society. The revolution had destroyed the old order, but failed to create stable institutions to replace it. Traditional sources of authority like monarchy and aristocracy were gone. New republican institutions lacked the legitimacy that comes from time and successful performance. French people were exhausted by constant political upheaval. They wanted peace, prosperity, and predictable government. The Directory provided none of these things. Its weakness and instability prepared the way for stronger authority that could impose order on revolutionary chaos. The Directory inherited enormous financial problems that previous revolutionary governments had failed to solve. French currency was collapsing as people lost confidence in paper money, backed by confiscated church and noble lands. The assignats that had financed the revolution were becoming worthless pieces of paper. Inflation reached astronomical levels during 1795 and 1796. Prices doubled and tripled within months as merchants refused to accept assignats at face value. Workers who were paid in paper money found that their wages could not buy basic necessities. The revolution was impoverishing the very people it claimed to serve. The government tried to solve the currency crisis by printing more assignats to meet its expenses. But this only made inflation worse as the amount of paper money increased faster than the goods available for purchase. Economic theory was ignored in favour of short-term political expedients. By 1796, the assignat had lost 99% of its original value. A loaf of bread that had cost 4 assignats in 1790 now cost 400 assignats. Workers needed wheelbarrows to carry enough paper money to buy food for their families. The revolutionary currency had become a bitter joke. The Directory finally abandoned the assignats in 1797 and returned to gold and silver currency. But this transition created new problems as the government lacked sufficient precious metal to meet its needs. Credit dried up, trade slowed dramatically, unemployment increased as businesses could not obtain working capital. Social unrest accompanied economic hardship as hungry people demanded government action to address their suffering. Bread riots broke out in Paris and other cities during the worst periods of shortage. Women led many of these protests, demanding food for their children and lower prices for necessities. The Directory's response to popular unrest was typically inconsistent and ineffective. Sometimes they tried to address economic grievances through price controls and food distribution. Other times they used military force to suppress protests. They had no coherent economic policy or consistent approach to social problems. Revolutionary enthusiasm that had sustained people through earlier hardships was largely exhausted by the mid-1790s. Citizens had sacrificed for the revolution for years without seeing promised improvements in their lives. Many began to wonder if the old regime might have provided better economic conditions. The Directory's economic failures created opportunities for more radical movements that promised fundamental changes in property relationships. François-Noël Babeuf, who called himself Gracchus Babeuf after the ancient Roman agrarian reformer, emerged as the leader of the most important radical challenge to the regime. Babeuf and his followers developed what they called the conspiracy of equals. They argued that political equality was meaningless without economic equality. The revolution had replaced aristocratic privilege with bourgeois privilege. Real freedom required the abolition of private property itself. These early socialist ideas went far beyond anything previous revolutionaries had imagined. Even the most radical Jacobins had accepted private property as a natural right. Babeuf argued that property was the source of inequality and oppression. Only collective ownership could create genuine liberty and justice. The conspiracy of equals attracted support among urban workers who had seen their economic conditions worsen under the Directory. They organised secret societies and planned to overthrow the government through coordinated uprisings in Paris and other cities. Their goal was to create a communist society based on common ownership. Babeuf's movement remained small and never posed a serious threat to the Directory's survival. Most French people were not ready for such radical economic changes. They wanted stability and prosperity, not revolutionary experiments with property relationships. The conspiracy was easily suppressed when the government discovered its plans, but the conspiracy of equals was historically significant as the first modern socialist movement. It introduced ideas about economic equality and collective ownership that would influence radical thinking for generations to come. Babeuf became a martyr for later socialist movements that would draw inspiration from his example. The Directory's economic policies generally favoured wealthy property owners at the expense of workers and peasants. Tax collection was reorganised to protect the interests of those who had purchased national lands during the Revolution. These new property owners became conservative supporters of the regime that protected their acquisitions. But the Directory could not solve the fundamental problem of French public finances. Government expenses continued to exceed revenues as military costs consumed enormous resources. Borrowing became increasingly difficult as creditors lost confidence in the regime's stability and competence. The Directory began relying on military conquest to solve economic problems that domestic policy could not address. French armies were expected to support themselves by looting conquered territories. War became a means of transferring wealth from foreign countries to French treasury. This policy worked temporarily as French victories brought gold and silver into French coffers, but it also made the regime dependent on continued military success. Any major defeats would create financial crises that could topple the government. Economic policy was becoming subordinated to military strategy. The Directory's economic failures prepared the way for Napoleon's rise to power. People were willing to sacrifice political freedom for economic stability and prosperity. A strong leader who could provide order and efficiency seemed preferable to weak civilian politicians who could deliver neither liberty nor security. While the Directory struggled with political and economic problems at home, French armies achieved remarkable successes on foreign battlefields. Revolutionary enthusiasm and new military tactics proved superior to traditional European warfare. French soldiers carried republican ideals across the continent along with their weapons. The wars that began in 1792 had transformed into a general European conflict by the mid-1790s. Britain, Austria, Prussia, Spain, and other powers formed coalitions to contain French expansion and revolutionary influence. But their traditional military methods could not cope with innovative French strategies and motivated soldiers. French armies were larger and more flexible than their opponents. The levée en masse had mobilized the entire population for war. Young men served as soldiers while older citizens produced weapons and supplies. France could field armies of unprecedented size while maintaining them through national resources. Revolutionary ideology also gave French soldiers advantages over their enemies. They fought for liberty and equality rather than dynastic interests. They believed they were liberating oppressed peoples from aristocratic tyranny. This sense of mission motivated troops to endure hardships and fight with exceptional courage. New military tactics developed during the revolutionary period proved devastatingly effective against traditional European armies. French forces used rapid movement and concentrated attacks to overwhelm enemies before they could respond. Artillery was employed more aggressively to break enemy lines and create opportunities for infantry assaults. Young officers promoted based on merit rather than noble birth brought fresh thinking to military strategy. They were willing to take risks and adopt innovations that conservative aristocratic generals would never have considered. The revolution had created a new generation of military leaders who combined professional skill with ideological commitment. Napoleon Bonaparte emerged as the most successful of these revolutionary generals. Born in Corsica just after that island was acquired by France, he was educated in French military schools and embraced republican ideals. His exceptional abilities quickly brought him to the attention of revolutionary authorities. Napoleon first gained prominence during the Siege of Toulon in 1793, when his artillery tactics enabled Republican forces to retake the city from British occupation. His success led to rapid promotion despite his youth. By 1796, at age 26, he was commanding the Army of Italy in France's war against Austria. The Italian campaigns of 1796 to 1797 made Napoleon famous throughout Europe. He defeated larger Austrian armies through rapid movement and brilliant tactical innovations. His victories at Lodi, Arcole, and Rivoli demonstrated that European military traditions were obsolete when confronted with revolutionary warfare. But Napoleon's Italian successes were more than just military achievements. He proved himself to be a skilled diplomat and administrator who could organize conquered territories effectively. He negotiated treaties that brought enormous wealth to France, while spreading revolutionary principles throughout northern Italy. Napoleon's bulletins describing his victories were published in French newspapers and made him a popular hero at home. People who were suffering under the Directory's failures could take pride in their general's triumphs abroad. Military success compensated for domestic disappointments. The young general also demonstrated political ambitions that went beyond purely military concerns. He cultivated relationships with influential politicians and journalists. He presented himself as the savior of republican institutions against both foreign enemies and domestic corruption. His propaganda portrayed him as indispensable to the revolution's success. After concluding peace with Austria through the Treaty of Campo Formio in 1797, Napoleon sought new opportunities to maintain his prominence. The Directory approved his proposal for an expedition to Egypt that would threaten British interests in the Mediterranean and perhaps establish a French empire in the Orient. The Egyptian expedition of 1798-1799 captured popular imagination, even though its practical results were limited. Napoleon presented the campaign as bringing Enlightenment values to ancient lands. He brought scholars and scientists along with soldiers to study Egyptian culture and make new discoveries. The discovery of the Rosetta Stone during the Egyptian campaign would eventually unlock the secrets of hieroglyphic writing. French scholars compiled detailed studies of Egyptian art, architecture, and history. The expedition contributed to European understanding of ancient civilizations even as it failed militarily. But the Egyptian campaign also demonstrated Napoleon's willingness to abandon his responsibilities when they no longer served his interests. When he learned of French defeats in Europe and the Directory's growing instability, he secretly left his army in Egypt and returned to France to pursue political opportunities. Napoleon's return to France in October 1799 coincided with a severe crisis that threatened the Directory's survival. Military defeats had eliminated the financial resources that foreign conquest provided. Political divisions were paralyzing government action. Popular support for republican institutions was collapsing. Many politicians began to see Napoleon as the strong leader who could save the Republic from both foreign enemies and domestic chaos. His military reputation suggested that he could restore France's international position. His republican credentials implied that he would preserve revolutionary achievements while providing more effective leadership. The growing influence of military leaders in politics reflected the Directory's fundamental weakness. Civilian politicians could not maintain order or provide effective government. Citizens were losing faith in republican institutions and looking to successful generals for leadership and stability. Napoleon understood that political opportunity was presenting itself. The Directory was discredited and vulnerable. Foreign enemies were gaining advantages over French forces. Popular opinion was ready for change. The time was approaching when military success could be converted into political power. The conspiracy to overthrow the Directory began in the autumn of 1799 when several prominent politicians approached Napoleon about joining a coup against the existing government. Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, one of the original revolutionary theorists, wanted to create a new constitution that would provide stronger executive authority while preserving republican forms. The conspirators believed that Napoleon's military reputation would provide the popular support necessary for their coup to succeed. They also assumed that the young general would be content to serve as the figurehead for a government controlled by experienced civilian politicians. This proved to be a serious miscalculation of Napoleon's ambitions. The coup was scheduled for 18 Brumaire Year VIII, November 9, 1799, in the revolutionary calendar. The conspirators planned to move the legislative councils from Paris to Saint-Cloud, ostensibly for security reasons. There, away from potential popular interference, they would vote to establish a new provisional government. Napoleon's role was supposed to be limited to providing military protection for the legislators and ensuring that opposition groups could not interfere with their deliberations. The actual political changes would be implemented by civilian leaders who understood constitutional law and parliamentary procedure better than soldiers. The first phase of the coup proceeded smoothly. The Council of Elders voted to transfer their meetings to Saint-Cloud and appointed Napoleon as commander of troops in the Paris region. This gave him legal authority to deploy military forces and maintain the appearance of constitutional legality for the conspiracy. But problems developed when the legislators assembled at Saint-Cloud on 19th Brumaire and November 10th. The Council of 500 was suspicious of the conspiracy and hostile to Napoleon personally. When he attempted to address them, deputies shouted denunciations and physically threatened the general. Napoleon's brother Lucien, who was president of the Council of 500, probably saved the coup from failure. When deputies called for Napoleon to be declared an outlaw, Lucien dramatically removed his presidential insignia and declared that he would rather die than preside over his brother's condemnation. The decisive moment came when Lucien summoned troops to clear the legislative chamber of hostile deputies. Soldiers with bayonets forced the legislators to flee through windows and doors in undignified panic. The coup was succeeding through military force rather than political manipulation. Later that evening, the remaining cooperative deputies voted to establish a provisional government called the Consulate. Executive power would be exercised by 3 consuls: Napoleon Bonaparte, Roger Ducos, and Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès. This triumvirate would govern France while a new constitution was being prepared. But it quickly became apparent that Napoleon intended to dominate the new government rather than share power equally with his colleagues. He took the title of First Consul and assumed responsibility for the most important decisions. The other consuls became junior partners in what was rapidly becoming a personal dictatorship. The Constitution of Year VIII, promulgated in December 1799, gave the first consul enormous powers while maintaining the fiction of republican government. Napoleon could appoint ministers, command armies, negotiate treaties, and propose laws. The legislative bodies retained theoretical authority, but lacked practical influence over policy. Popular ratification of the new constitution was arranged through a plebiscite that asked citizens to vote yes or no on the proposed government. The results showed overwhelming support for Napoleon's regime, though the voting procedures made genuine opposition difficult to express and the counts were probably manipulated. The establishment of the consulate marked the effective end of the French Revolution as a popular democratic movement. Power had passed from elected representatives to a military dictator who ruled through personal authority rather than constitutional procedures. The revolution was consuming itself through its own success. Napoleon justified his seizure of power by arguing that only strong leadership could preserve revolutionary achievements against foreign enemies and domestic chaos. The Directory had proven incapable of providing stability or effective government. Republican institutions required protection by someone who understood both military and political necessities. Many French people welcomed Napoleon's rise to power because they were exhausted by political instability and economic hardship. They wanted order, prosperity, and national glory rather than continued revolutionary experimentation. A successful general seemed more likely to provide these things than weak civilian politicians. The transition from republic to personal rule occurred gradually as Napoleon consolidated his authority and eliminated potential opposition. He maintained republican terminology and institutions while steadily reducing their actual power. France was becoming an authoritarian state disguised as a constitutional government, but Napoleon also preserved and extended many revolutionary achievements that might have been lost under a restored monarchy. The principles of legal equality, religious tolerance, and merit-based advancement remained central to French society. The Code Civil would spread these ideas throughout Europe as Napoleon's armies carried French law to conquered territories. The consulate represented both the end of the revolutionary period and the beginning of a new chapter in French history. The ideals of 1789 had been transformed but not abandoned. They would continue to influence French politics and European development long after Napoleon's empire had fallen and been forgotten. Napoleon Bonaparte had seized power, promising to preserve the revolution's achievements while restoring order to France. But what exactly were those achievements worth preserving? And how could revolutionary principles survive under authoritarian rule? These questions would shape Napoleon's domestic policies for the next 15 years. The most important and lasting of Napoleon's reforms was the Civil Code, enacted on March 21, 1804. This comprehensive legal document replaced the fragmented laws of pre-revolutionary France with a unified system that applied to all French citizens. The Code represented Napoleon's interpretation of the French Revolution, built upon Enlightenment ideals. The Civil Code protected many gains of the French Revolution by ensuring equality of all male citizens before the law. Noble birth no longer provided legal privileges. A peasant and a former duke faced identical treatment in French courts. This principle of legal equality would influence legal systems around the world for centuries to come. But equality had limits under Napoleon's code. Women remained legally subordinate to their husbands and fathers. They could not own property independently or make contracts without male permission. The revolution's promise of universal rights applied only to men, despite women's crucial participation in revolutionary events. The code also established the secular character of French law. Marriage became a civil contract rather than a religious sacrament. Divorce was permitted under specific circumstances. Religious authorities could no longer control family relationships or inheritance matters. The state had replaced the church as the ultimate source of legal authority. Property rights received strong protection under the Civil Code. The revolutionary sales of church and noble lands were confirmed as permanent and legal. Middle-class purchasers of national property could rest assured that their investments were secure. Private property became sacred under law even as political freedom disappeared. Napoleon's legal reforms extended far beyond the Civil Code itself. He reorganized the entire French judicial system to ensure uniform application of laws throughout the country. Local customs and regional variations that had characterized the old regime were eliminated in favor of national standards. The University of France, established in 1808, created a centralized educational system that would train loyal citizens for the new state. Education became secular and merit-based rather than religious and class-based. Talented individuals from humble backgrounds could advance through academic achievement rather than noble birth. But Napoleon's educational system also served authoritarian purposes by indoctrinating students with loyalty to the emperor and the state. Critical thinking was discouraged in favor of obedience and conformity. The revolution's emphasis on citizen participation was replaced by emphasis on citizen submission. The Concordat of 1801 represented Napoleon's compromise with the Catholic Church. This agreement recognized Catholicism as the religion of the majority of French people, while maintaining state control over church appointments and policies. Priests became state employees who could be hired and fired by government authorities. The Concordat ended the religious conflicts that had torn France apart since the civil constitution of the clergy. Most French people welcomed the return of religious stability, even if the church's independence was limited. Napoleon understood that social peace required accommodation with popular religious beliefs. Administrative centralization became another hallmark of the Napoleonic system. The old provinces with their ancient privileges were permanently eliminated. France was divided into uniform departments, administered by prefects, appointed by the central government. Local autonomy disappeared in favour of national unity and efficiency. This centralization allowed Napoleon to mobilize French resources more effectively than any previous government had managed. Tax collection improved dramatically. Military recruitment became systematic and fair. Public works projects were coordinated on a national scale. Administrative efficiency increased enormously, but centralization also eliminated the local participation in government that had characterized the early revolution. Citizens became subjects again, albeit subjects with legal rights and economic opportunities. Democratic participation was sacrificed for administrative effectiveness and political stability. The principle of meritocracy became fundamental to Napoleon's system. Government positions, military commissions, and educational opportunities were awarded based on talent and achievement rather than birth or connections. The revolution's promise of careers open to talent was finally fulfilled under authoritarian rule. The Legion of Honor, established in 1802, created a new aristocracy based on service rather than blood. Distinguished soldiers, administrators, artists, and scientists received honours that acknowledged their contributions to French society. Merit replaced heredity as the basis for social distinction. This meritocratic system produced remarkable results. French administration, military leadership, and cultural achievement flourished under Napoleon's rule. Talented individuals who would have been ignored under the old regime rose to positions of influence and responsibility. But meritocracy also created new forms of inequality to replace the old ones. Educational advantages allowed middle-class families to maintain their social positions across generations. Access to opportunity remained limited for those without connections or resources. The revolution's promise of genuine equality remained unfulfilled. Napoleon's domestic reform succeeded in consolidating revolutionary changes while eliminating revolutionary instability. The civil code and administrative system he created lasted far longer than his military empire. Even today, France operates under legal and administrative structures that Napoleon established. But this success came at the cost of political freedom and democratic participation. Napoleon had solved the problem of how to preserve revolutionary achievements without preserving revolutionary politics. Strong government could implement progressive policies while suppressing popular opposition. The Napoleonic settlement became a model for authoritarian modernization that would influence political development around the world. Effective government and progressive policies were possible without democracy or popular participation. Enlightened despotism could deliver the benefits of revolution without its chaos and instability. Napoleon's armies carried revolutionary ideas across Europe along with French weapons and laws. The wars that began as conflicts between revolutionary France and monarchical Europe became vehicles for spreading new concepts of government, law, and society throughout the continent. The coalition wars that raged from 1792 to 1815 transformed European politics forever. Traditional monarchy faced systematic challenges from revolutionary nationalism and popular sovereignty. Ancient dynasties found themselves defending not just territory, but entire ways of organizing human society. French armies did not simply conquer territory. They reorganized conquered lands according to revolutionary principles. Feudalism was abolished wherever French influence extended. Legal equality replaced aristocratic privilege. Religious tolerance was imposed on intolerant societies. The old Europe of kings and nobles began disappearing. The German states experienced particularly dramatic changes under French occupation. The Holy Roman Empire, which had existed for over 1,000 years, was dissolved in 1806. Hundreds of small principalities were consolidated into larger, more rational administrative units. The Napoleonic Code replaced local customs and privileges. But French liberation often felt like French oppression to the peoples who experienced it. Heavy taxation, military conscription, and economic exploitation accompanied political reform. Many Europeans began to see the French as conquerors rather than liberators. Revolutionary ideals became associated with foreign domination. This resistance to French rule paradoxically spread revolutionary concepts even further. European peoples learned to organize themselves as nations rather than subjects of dynasties. They discovered that popular unity could resist foreign armies. Nationalism became the weapon that defeated Napoleon and transformed Europe. German nationalism emerged directly from resistance to French occupation. Intellectuals like Johann Gottlieb Fiede called for German unity based on common language, culture, and history rather than dynastic loyalty. The idea of the nation as a community of equals replaced the idea of the state as royal property. Spanish guerrilla warfare against French occupation demonstrated that popular resistance could exhaust even the most powerful armies. Ordinary people fighting for their homeland proved more effective than professional soldiers fighting for pay. The Spanish example inspired resistance movements throughout Europe. The continental system, Napoleon's attempt to exclude British trade from European markets, inadvertently encouraged economic nationalism. European countries began developing domestic industries to replace British goods. Economic self-sufficiency became associated with political independence from foreign control. Italian unification movements drew inspiration from French revolutionary nationalism, while opposing French political domination. Secret societies like the Carbonari promoted Italian unity and constitutional government. They used revolutionary methods to achieve national goals that went beyond what Napoleon intended. The Haitian Revolution represented the most radical extension of French revolutionary principles. Enslaved Africans in the French colony of Saint-Domingue applied the Declaration of Rights to their own situation. If all men were born free and equal, slavery was obviously illegal and immoral. Toussaint Louverture and other Haitian leaders used revolutionary language to justify their rebellion against French colonial authority. They cited the same principles that French revolutionaries had used against royal absolutism. The revolution's logic led inevitably to the abolition of slavery and racial equality. The successful Haitian Revolution terrified slave owners throughout the Americas, while inspiring enslaved people everywhere. It proved that revolutionary principles were truly universal, rather than limited to white Europeans. The Declaration of Rights meant what it said about human equality and natural freedom. Napoleon's attempt to restore slavery in Haiti led to renewed warfare, and ultimately to Haitian independence in 1804. The French Revolution had created its most radical offspring in the Caribbean. A nation of former slaves became the Second Republic in the Western Hemisphere. Latin American independence movements drew direct inspiration from both the French Revolution and Haitian example. Simón Bolívar, José de San Martín, and other leaders used revolutionary rhetoric to justify rebellion against Spanish colonial rule. They established republics based on popular sovereignty and constitutional government. The Spanish-American Wars of Independence spread revolutionary ideas throughout the Western Hemisphere. Constitutional conventions met to establish new governments based on separation of powers and protection of individual rights. The United States was no longer the only republic in the Americas, but Latin American revolutions also revealed the limitations of revolutionary idealism when confronted with social and economic realities. Legal equality coexisted with massive inequality of wealth and opportunity. Constitutional government often gave way to military dictatorship. Revolutionary promises exceeded practical possibilities. The Congress of Vienna in 1815 attempted to restore the old European order after Napoleon's defeat, but the revolutionary genie could not be forced back into its bottle. Nationalism, constitutionalism, and popular sovereignty had taken root throughout Europe and the Americas. Liberal revolutions erupted across Europe in 1820, 1830 and 1848 as peoples demanded constitutional government and national self-determination. The French Revolution's ideas continued to inspire democratic movements long after Napoleon's empire had collapsed. The spread of revolutionary nationalism created the modern European state system based on the principle that each nation deserved its own government. This principle would reshape the map of Europe and eventually the entire world as colonial empires dissolved and new nations emerged. Even conservative governments found themselves adopting revolutionary innovations when these proved administratively useful. Legal codes, educational systems, and administrative structures pioneered by the French Revolution were copied by monarchies that opposed revolutionary politics. The European impact of the French Revolution extended far beyond politics to influence literature, art, philosophy, and science. Romanticism emerged partly as a response to revolutionary rationalism. Universities were reorganized according to revolutionary principles of merit and secular learning. The French Revolution's most enduring legacy was the establishment of human rights as a universal concept that transcended national boundaries and cultural differences. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen became the foundation for countless later movements demanding freedom and equality around the world. The language of natural rights that the revolutionaries developed provided tools for oppressed peoples everywhere to articulate their demands for justice. Women, racial minorities, workers, and colonized peoples would invoke the same principles that French revolutionaries had used against royal absolutism and aristocratic privilege. The concept of popular sovereignty fundamentally altered the relationship between governments and governed throughout the world. No longer could rulers claim divine right or traditional authority as sufficient justification for their power. Legitimate government required popular consent expressed through constitutional procedures. Modern nationalism emerged directly from the French Revolution's emphasis on the nation as a community of equal citizens sharing common interests. This idea would reshape the political map of the world as peoples demanded self-determination and national independence from foreign rule. The revolution established the principle that constitutions should be written documents that clearly define government powers and protect individual rights. Constitutional government became the standard by which political legitimacy was measured throughout the democratic world. Secular education as a function of the state rather than religious institutions became widely accepted following the French example. Public schools were expected to produce informed citizens capable of participating in democratic government. Education became a right rather than a privilege. Civil marriage independent of religious ceremony was another revolutionary innovation that spread throughout the world. The state assumed responsibility for regulating family relationships and inheritance matters. Personal status became a civil rather than religious matter. The revolutionary calendar failed to replace traditional timekeeping, but the metric system of weights and measures succeeded in becoming the global standard. Scientific rationality triumphed over traditional custom in this important area of daily life. Religious tolerance and freedom of conscience, though imperfectly implemented during the revolution itself, became accepted principles of modern democratic government. No single religion could claim state support at the expense of others. Individual belief became a private matter protected from government interference. The abolition of feudalism and aristocratic privilege established legal equality as a fundamental principle of modern society. Social distinctions based on birth became illegitimate. Achievement and merit replaced heredity as the basis for social advancement. Women's rights remained limited during the revolutionary period, but the revolution's emphasis on universal human rights provided intellectual foundations for later feminist movements. If rights were truly natural and universal, they must apply to women as well as men. The revolution demonstrated that rapid social and political change was possible when sufficient popular will existed. Traditional institutions that had seemed permanent and unchangeable could be swept away within a few years. Human societies were not bound by ancient customs and privileges, but the revolution also revealed the enormous difficulties involved in creating stable democratic institutions. Political freedom proved easier to proclaim than to implement effectively. The gap between revolutionary ideals and practical realities would challenge democratic movements for centuries to come. Economic equality remained elusive despite legal and political equality. The revolution failed to solve the problem of poverty and inequality that had motivated much popular support for radical change. Constitutional government coexisted with massive disparities of wealth and opportunity. The relationship between individual liberty and collective decision-making created ongoing tensions in democratic societies. Majority rule could become majority tyranny if individual rights were not adequately protected. Balancing freedom and equality required constant vigilance and adjustment. Revolutionary violence provided both inspiration and warning for later democratic movements. Popular uprisings could overthrow oppressive governments, but they could also destroy innocent lives and democratic institutions. The means used to achieve political change shaped the character of resulting governments. The French Revolution established revolution itself as a legitimate response to political oppression. Peoples throughout the world would invoke the French example to justify their own struggles against tyranny and foreign domination. Revolution became a universal human right when other forms of political change were impossible. The French Revolution marked the decisive transition from traditional theories of government based on divine right and hereditary authority to modern concepts of popular sovereignty and constitutional democracy. This philosophical transformation reshaped political thinking throughout the world and continues to influence contemporary debates about government legitimacy. The concept of divine right monarchy, which had dominated European political thought for centuries, could not survive the revolution's systematic critique. If kings ruled by God's will, why did they make such terrible mistakes? If royal authority was sacred, why did it produce such unjust results? Revolutionary thinkers provided compelling answers to these questions. Social contract theory, developed by Enlightenment philosophers like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, became the new foundation for political authority. Government existed to serve the people, not the other way around. Citizens created political institutions to protect their natural rights and promote their common welfare. This philosophical shift had enormous practical implications. Governments that failed to serve popular interests lost their legitimacy and could rightfully be overthrown. Political authority flowed upward from the people, rather than downward from divine sources. Revolution became a natural right when other forms of political change were blocked. The tension between individual liberty and collective will that had troubled Rousseau became a central problem for democratic theory and practice. How could society protect individual rights while implementing majority decisions? How could minority interests be preserved in democratic systems based on majority rule? The French Revolution revealed both the promise and the peril of popular government. Democratic participation could produce wise policies and just laws when citizens were informed and virtuous. But it could also lead to mob rule and violent extremism when popular passion overwhelmed rational deliberation. The concept of limited government emerged from revolutionary experience with both royal tyranny and popular excess. Constitutional structures were needed to channel democratic energy while preventing the abuse of political power. Separation of powers and individual rights became essential features of legitimate government. Representative democracy developed as a practical solution to the problem of governing large populations according to democratic principles. Direct participation by all citizens was impossible in modern nations. Elected representatives could express popular will while providing deliberative wisdom that pure democracy might lack. The revolution established the principle that constitutions should be written, documents created by popular conventions, rather than ancient customs that evolved over time. Democratic peoples had the right to establish their own forms of government, according to their needs and values rather than accepting inherited institutions. But the revolution also demonstrated that successful democracy required more than just good institutions and noble intentions. Democratic culture, civic education, and economic opportunity were necessary foundations for sustainable popular government. Political equality meant little without broader social and economic reforms. The relationship between equality and liberty became a persistent tension in democratic thought. The revolution had promised both, but achieving one often seemed to require limiting the other. How much inequality could democracy tolerate? How much government intervention in private affairs did equality require? Revolutionary experience suggested that democracy was fragile and required constant protection against both external enemies and internal corruption. Citizens had to remain vigilant and engaged to prevent the gradual erosion of democratic institutions. Eternal vigilance was indeed the price of liberty. The French Revolution established revolution itself as a legitimate form of political action when peaceful change was impossible. This precedent would inspire democratic movements around the world, while also justifying violent upheavals that destroyed democratic institutions in the name of democratic ideals. The revolution's philosophical legacy proved more durable than its specific political achievements. The ideas that emerged during the revolutionary period continued to evolve and influence political development long after the specific events of 1789-1799 had passed into history. Modern democratic theory still grapples with questions that the French Revolution first posed in acute form. How can popular government remain both free and effective? How can democratic societies balance competing demands for liberty, equality, and order? How can constitutional democracy adapt to changing circumstances while preserving fundamental principles? The French Revolution did not provide final answers to these questions, but it established the framework within which democratic societies continue to seek solutions. The revolution created the modern vocabulary of democratic politics and identified the central challenges that democratic governments must address to survive and flourish. The philosophical transformation that began with the French Revolution remains incomplete. Each generation of democratic citizens must rediscover and reaffirm the principles of popular government. The revolution's most important legacy is not any specific institution or policy, but the ongoing commitment to human dignity and political freedom that it inspired and that continues to shape our world today. As we reach the end of this long journey through the French Revolution, we must confront the deepest paradoxes that emerge from humanity's greatest attempt to remake the world according to reason and justice. These contradictions were not accidents or failures of leadership. They were inherent tensions within the revolutionary project itself. The most striking paradox was how the pursuit of liberty led directly to authoritarian rule. The revolutionaries of 1789 sought to free French people from royal despotism. They proclaimed that all men were born free and equal. They established constitutional government based on popular sovereignty and individual rights. Yet within a decade, France was ruled by Napoleon Bonaparte, whose power exceeded anything the old kings had ever possessed. The emperor controlled every aspect of French life more thoroughly than Louis XVI had ever dreamed possible. Citizens who had overthrown one absolute ruler found themselves subjects of another. This transformation was not imposed from outside by foreign enemies. It emerged from within the revolutionary process itself. Each crisis that threatened liberty seemed to require stronger measures to preserve it. Emergency powers became permanent institutions. Temporary dictatorships became lasting tyrannies. The Committee of Public Safety had argued that terror was necessary to preserve freedom. Revolutionary government had to suspend constitutional rights to protect constitutional principles. Liberty could be saved only by temporarily destroying liberty. This logic led step by step to the scaffold and then to imperial throne. The revolution also promised equality but created new forms of hierarchy and privilege. Legal equality replaced aristocratic privilege, but economic inequality persisted and even expanded. The abolition of feudalism freed peasants from ancient obligations, but did not give them land or prosperity. Those who purchased national property during the Revolution became a new propertied class with interests as distinct from the poor as the old nobility had been. Merit replaced birth as the basis for advancement, but access to education and opportunity remained limited by wealth and connections. The Napoleonic system institutionalized these inequalities through its emphasis on meritocracy. Talented individuals could rise through service to the state, but most people remained trapped in the social positions where they were born. The revolution had changed the names of social classes without eliminating class distinctions themselves. Women discovered that universal rights were not truly universal. The Declaration of Rights proclaimed that all men were born free and equal, but it used masculine language that excluded half of humanity. Women had participated in every phase of the revolution, but were denied political participation under every revolutionary government. Olympe de Gouges and other feminist writers had pointed out these contradictions during the revolution itself. They demanded that the logic of natural rights be extended to include women as well as men. But revolutionary leaders, even the most radical, could not imagine genuine gender equality. The revolution proclaimed religious tolerance while conducting campaigns of violent dechristianization. It announced respect for human dignity while organizing mass executions. It promised peace and fraternity while spreading war across Europe. The gap between ideals and reality grew wider as revolutionary enthusiasm intensified. Perhaps the most troubling paradox was the use of violence in service of humanitarian ideals. The revolutionaries genuinely believed they were creating a better world for all humanity. They wanted to eliminate oppression, ignorance, and suffering. Their goals were noble and their intentions were pure, yet the pursuit of these humanitarian objectives led to the systematic murder of thousands of people. The guillotine operated daily in the name of virtue and justice. People were executed for crimes of thought and association that harmed no one. The revolution devoured its own children while claiming to act for the good of humanity. Saint-Just had declared that terror was nothing but justice, prompt, severe, and inflexible. This equation of violence with virtue reflected a fundamental confusion about means and ends. Good intentions could not transform murder into morality or brutality into benevolence. The revolutionaries faced genuine enemies who would have destroyed their achievements if given the opportunity. Counter-revolutionaries did conspire with foreign powers. Some violence was necessary to defend the new order against those who would restore the old. But the machinery of terror developed its own momentum beyond any rational calculation of necessity. Fear and paranoia transformed defensive violence into offensive aggression. The search for enemies became the creation of enemies. The revolution began eating itself as rival factions accused each other of treason and counter-revolution. Violence became an end in itself rather than a means to achieve justice. These paradoxes were not unique to the French Revolution. They have appeared in every major revolutionary movement since 1789. The Russian Revolution promised workers' paradise but created bureaucratic dictatorship. The Chinese Revolution sought peasant liberation but produced mass starvation. The Cambodian Revolution proclaimed national purification but committed genocide. The pattern suggests that revolution itself contains inherent contradictions that are difficult to resolve. The destruction of old institutions creates power vacuums that ambitious individuals can fill. The suspension of normal legal procedures makes tyranny easier to establish. The mobilization of popular passion makes rational deliberation nearly impossible. Understanding these paradoxes does not mean rejecting revolutionary ideals or accepting unjust conditions. The French Revolution's failures do not invalidate its insights about human dignity and political freedom, but they do suggest the need for humility and caution in attempting to remake the world through political action. The French Revolution offers profound lessons about both the power and the peril of popular movements seeking fundamental social change. These lessons remain relevant today as peoples around the world continue to struggle for freedom, equality, and justice in their own societies. Popular movements possess enormous power to transform seemingly permanent institutions when sufficient numbers of people unite around common goals. The French Revolution demonstrated that ordinary citizens acting together could overthrow ancient monarchies, abolish feudalism, and establish new forms of government based on popular consent. But popular power is also dangerous and unpredictable. Crowds can become mobs that destroy innocent lives along with unjust institutions. Democratic participation can degenerate into mob rule that threatens the very freedoms it claims to protect. The people's voice can become the tyrant's weapon when manipulated by skilled demagogues. The revolution revealed both the necessity and the difficulty of creating stable institutions that can channel popular energy toward constructive ends. Constitutional government requires more than just good intentions and noble ideals. It demands practical wisdom about human nature and political processes that revolutionary enthusiasm often lacks. Institutional change through legal procedures is slower and less dramatic than revolutionary transformation, but it is also more likely to produce lasting results that serve human needs effectively. The gradual evolution of democratic institutions may accomplish more than violent upheavals that destroy existing structures without creating adequate replacements. The role of ideas in historical transformation became clear during the French Revolution. Enlightenment concepts about natural rights, popular sovereignty, and constitutional government provided the intellectual framework that made revolutionary action possible. Ideas truly have consequences when they capture popular imagination and inspire organized action. But ideas alone are not sufficient to create successful revolutions or stable governments. Social and economic conditions must be ready for change. Political leadership must be skillful and dedicated. International circumstances must permit domestic transformation. Ideas provide direction, but material factors determine outcomes. The French Revolution also demonstrated the crucial importance of economic factors in driving political upheaval. Financial crisis forced the calling of the Estates General. Bread shortages fueled popular anger. Economic inequality motivated demands for political change. Food riots preceded political revolutions throughout the revolutionary period. Modern revolutionary movements ignore economic realities at their peril. Political freedom means little to people who cannot feed their families or find meaningful work. Constitutional rights provide cold comfort to those who lack basic necessities. Revolutionary governments must address material needs as well as abstract principles to maintain popular support. The relationship between violence and political change remains one of the revolution's most troubling lessons. Some violence may be necessary to overthrow deeply entrenched oppression that cannot be changed through peaceful means. But violence tends to escalate beyond rational control once it begins. The means used to achieve political goals shape the character of resulting institutions. Revolutionary leaders must constantly weigh the costs of violence against the benefits of change. They must ask whether their goals justify the suffering their methods will cause. They must consider whether violent means will corrupt the peaceful ends they seek to achieve. These calculations are never easy and often prove tragically wrong. The French Revolution's international impact shows how ideas and institutions developed in one country can influence political development throughout the world. Revolutionary nationalism inspired independence movements from Haiti to Latin America. Constitutional democracy became a model for reformers everywhere. Human rights became a universal language for demanding justice. But the export of revolutionary ideals through military conquest proved counterproductive. Peoples who were liberated by foreign armies often came to resent their liberators. Revolutionary principles seemed more legitimate when they emerged from indigenous movements than when they were imposed by external force. Cultural and historical differences limited the universal applicability of any single revolutionary model. Perhaps the most important lesson is that revolution is easier to begin than to control or conclude successfully. Destroying old institutions requires only popular anger and organized violence. Creating new institutions that serve human needs effectively requires wisdom, patience, and practical experience that revolutionary situations rarely provide. The French Revolution succeeded in eliminating many injustices of the old regime but failed to create the just society it promised. Its legacy is mixed. Inspiring ideals combined with tragic failures, noble goals pursued through questionable means, universal principles applied with particular limitations. Yet despite its failures and contradictions, the French Revolution expanded human possibilities in ways that continue to influence our world today. It established principles and precedents that later movements could build upon. It proved that fundamental change was possible when people were willing to struggle for it. It created vocabulary and concepts that oppressed peoples everywhere could use to demand their rights. As we conclude this long journey through the French Revolution, we are left with eternal questions that each generation must answer for itself. These questions have no final solutions, but grappling with them helps us understand both the possibilities and the limitations of human political action. What price should be paid for freedom? The French revolutionaries sacrificed thousands of lives in their pursuit of liberty and equality. They disrupted millions more lives through constant upheaval and change. They created suffering and chaos in the name of ending oppression and injustice. Was the price they paid worth the freedom they achieved? This question admits no easy answer because it requires weighing immediate costs against long-term benefits, individual suffering against collective gain, concrete losses against abstract principles. The peasant who died in revolutionary violence paid a higher price than the peasant who gained legal equality. The benefits and costs of revolution were never distributed equally among those who experienced it. Each society facing oppression must calculate this equation for itself based on its own circumstances and values. Sometimes gradual reform may accomplish more than violent revolution at lower human cost. Sometimes revolution may be the only way to break cycles of oppression that would otherwise continue indefinitely. The choice depends on factors that cannot be predicted in advance. Can violent means achieve peaceful ends? The French revolutionaries used terror to create virtue, war to establish peace, dictatorship to preserve democracy. They justified brutal methods by pointing to noble goals. But did violence corrupt the ends it was supposed to serve? Did the means change the character of the institutions they created? The evidence from the French Revolution suggests that violent means tend to perpetuate themselves even after their original justification has disappeared. The machinery of terror continued operating after external threats had diminished. Military methods of decision-making replaced civilian deliberation. Habits of coercion proved difficult to abandon once they became established. Yet complete pacifism in the face of violent oppression may simply enable tyrants to continue their crimes unchallenged. Sometimes defensive violence may be necessary to protect innocent people and preserve space for peaceful political development. The challenge is distinguishing between necessary and unnecessary violence, between defensive and offensive action. How do ordinary people become revolutionaries? What transforms loyal subjects into rebellious citizens? What makes people risk everything they have for uncertain political goals? The French Revolution showed that revolutionary consciousness could develop rapidly under the right conditions, but what exactly were those conditions? Economic hardship alone does not create revolutions. Many societies have endured poverty and oppression without rebelling. Revolutionary ideas alone are not sufficient either. Many people have embraced radical concepts without taking revolutionary action. Revolution requires the combination of material grievances, intellectual frameworks, political opportunities, and leadership that can unite disparate groups around common goals. The French Revolution revealed that revolutionary potential exists in every human society. People everywhere desire dignity, justice, and control over their own lives. Under the right circumstances, these desires can motivate extraordinary acts of courage and sacrifice. But predicting when and where such circumstances will emerge remains impossible. What makes revolutions succeed or fail? Why did the French Revolution achieve some of its goals while failing to accomplish others? Why have some later revolutions produced stable democracies while others collapsed into dictatorship or chaos? What factors determine revolutionary outcomes? Success and failure in revolutionary movements depend on complex interactions among leadership quality, institutional design, economic conditions, international circumstances, and popular support that vary from case to case. No single factor determines outcomes, and similar conditions can produce very different results in different historical contexts. The French Revolution succeeded in destroying the old regime but failed to create stable democratic institutions. It achieved legal equality but not economic justice. It established human rights as universal principles but did not extend those rights to all humans. Its partial successes and failures created precedents that influenced all subsequent revolutionary movements.